There is a particular kind of darkness that settles over a factory town at the end of a long shift. It is not the darkness of fields or forests. It is not the soft, breathing dark of the countryside, where the stars press close and the silence is ancient and unhurried. This is a different kind of dark. It carries the smell of machine oil and river water. It carries the faint metallic taste of industry. It settles into the eaves of row houses and hangs in the narrow streets between tenement windows, and it is heavy with the weight of hands that have worked all day and will work again tomorrow. In Orange, New Jersey, in the early years of the 1920s, there was a particular light inside the darkness. It came from the upstairs floors of a factory on Alden Street. It was pale, it was green, and it glowed. If you enjoy listening to History Sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly, to understand what happened in that factory, to understand it fully and gently, and in the way that history deserves to be understood when it concerns ordinary people who were failed by extraordinary institutions. You must first understand the world that made those women. The 1920s in America were a decade of dazzling contradictions. It was a time of new money and old prejudice, a time when skirts rose above the ankle for the first time in recorded memory, and the radio crackled with jazz from cities that never seemed to sleep, and the automobile became something that ordinary families could dream about owning. The decade is remembered, in retrospect, as a gilded interval, the Roaring Twenties, a name applied later, a label that suggests champagne and saxophone music, and the particular carelessness of people who do not yet know what is coming for them. And much of it was that, for some people. But for the women who worked in the dial painting studios of New Jersey and Illinois and Connecticut, the 1920s was something quieter and more careful. They were a decade of weekly wages and shared lunches, of leather aprons and careful brushwork, of the particular pride that comes from doing skilled work well, from earning your own money, from being part of something that felt, in its way, important. These were young women, mostly. Girls, some of them, 17, 18, 19 years old. They had come from the neighbourhoods around the factories, from the Italian and Irish and Polish immigrant families that had settled in the industrial towns of New Jersey in the decades following the Civil War. Their fathers worked in the tanneries and the hardware factories. Their mothers kept houses that smelled of bread and cabbage. They had younger brothers and sisters, crowded into rooms that were never quite warm enough in winter, never quite cool enough in summer. Work was not optional for these young women. It was simply part of life, as natural and necessary as eating and sleeping. And by the standards of the early 1920s, the United States Radium Corporation offered very good work indeed. The factory sat on Alden Street in Orange, New Jersey, a building that was neither beautiful nor particularly ugly, the kind of utilitarian structure that a prosperous industrial town produced without ceremony or regret. It had been established in 1917 during the final years of the First World War, and it had found its purpose in a product that felt, in those years, almost magical. Radium. The element had been discovered by Marie Curie and her husband Pierre in 1898, isolated from tons of pitchblende ore in a process that had required years of painstaking labour and a tolerance for physical discomfort that bordered on the heroic. Marie Curie would win 2 Nobel Prizes for her work, one in physics, one in chemistry, a distinction no person has matched before or since. She carried samples of radium salts in her coat pockets. She kept them by her bedside. She described the faint blue-green glow they produced in darkness as beautiful, as one of the loveliest things she had ever seen. She did not know then what the glow was doing to her. But that is a story we will return to. In the years between Curie's discovery and the opening of the factory on Alden Street, radium had passed through the cultural imagination of the Western world and emerged transformed. It was no longer simply a scientific curiosity, an element at the far end of the periodic table. It had become something close to a wonder drug. Advertisements in magazines and newspapers celebrated radium-infused tonics, radium face creams, radium chocolate, radium water. There were clinics that offered radium injections for everything from arthritis to impotence to vague spiritual malaise. The element's radioactive properties, poorly understood, largely unmeasured, and entirely unregulated, were associated in the popular mind with vitality, with energy, with the force of life itself. This was not entirely irrational, given what people knew at the time. Radium did produce warmth, it did cause certain materials to fluoresce in darkness, and it had been observed, in clinical settings, to affect living tissue. which was interpreted optimistically as evidence of healing power rather than cellular destruction. The particular application that the United States Radium Corporation had built its business upon was the luminous watch dial. The idea was elegant in its simplicity. Soldiers in the field, sailors on night watches, aviators in open cockpits. All of them needed to read the time in darkness. The standard solution, a watch crystal read by the light of a match or lantern, was inadequate and often dangerous. What was needed was a dial that glowed on its own. Radium mixed with zinc sulfide and a binding agent produced exactly that. The mixture, which the workers would come to call simply the paint, though it was not paint in any conventional sense, glowed with a steady, cold, greenish-white light. It required no battery, no flame, no external illumination of any kind. It simply glowed, continuously, reliably, with an efficiency that seemed almost alive. During the First World War, the demand for luminous dials had been extraordinary. The military contracts alone had made the United States Radium Corporation enormously profitable. And after the war, as the appetite for wristwatches grew among the civilian population, the demand did not diminish. If anything, it increased. A luminous wristwatch was a luxury item, a status symbol, a modern accessory for a modern age. The factory on Alden Street was expanded, new studios were opened, workers were hired, and here is where the young women of Orange, New Jersey entered the story. The work of painting luminous watch dials required a particular kind of skill. The numbers and markings on a watch dial are very small. The brushes used to paint them must be very fine. And if the brush tip loses its point, as brush tips will, with use, the line becomes blurry, the numbers uncertain, the dial imprecise. The accepted technique for maintaining a fine brush point, taught to every new dial painter by her supervisor, was simple and unremarkable. You placed the brush between your lips. You drew it gently through your mouth, wetting the bristles slightly and drawing them to a fine point. Then you dipped the brush into the luminous paint. Then you painted. Lip dip paint. Lip dip paint. The supervisors called it lip pointing. It was standard practice, taught as a matter of course, repeated dozens of times each hour, hundreds of times each working day. The women who did it were told, when they thought to ask, that the paint was harmless, that it contained only a trace amount of radium, that the scientists who worked in the laboratory downstairs wore rubber gloves and surgical masks, not because they were protecting themselves from danger, but because they were protecting their sensitive experiments from contamination by human hands. This was a lie, a careful, deliberate corporate lie. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. For now, let us simply sit with the picture of the studio as it was in those early years, before the teeth began to loosen, and the bones began to ache, and the jaws began to collapse. The dial painting studio occupied the upper floors of the factory. It was a long room, well lit during the day by tall windows, and the women sat at long tables in rows, each with her small tray of luminous paint and her cup of brushes and her rack of watch frames waiting to be filled. The room smelled of the paint, a faintly metallic smell, not unpleasant, almost clinical. The sound was the quiet sound of careful work, the small tap of brush against palette, the scratch of a chair, the low murmur of conversation between women who had known each other since school. They talked about everything that young women talk about their families, about their young men, the ones who came courting on Sunday afternoons, about the picture shows and what was playing at the theatre on Main Street, about wages and what they were saving for, and what they had spent their last week's pay on, and whether the foreman was in a good mood or a bad one. And sometimes, at the end of the shift, when the lights in the studio were switched off and the women gathered their things to leave, one of them would hold up her hands in the dark, and her hands would glow. They were luminous, faintly, softly, with that same cold green-white light that the paint itself produced. It was on their fingers, their wrists, their aprons. Some of it had gotten into their hair, and the fine wisps that had escaped their caps glowed gently around their faces like a halo made of something stranger and more modern than gold. They thought it was beautiful. Some of them painted their nails with it at the end of a shift purely for vanity. Some painted their teeth so they could smile in the dark at their young men and watch the startled delight cross their faces. Some painted their faces entirely, cheekbones and forehead and the bridge of the nose, and ran laughing through the factory yard at night, ghostly and luminous, and very young. They were told it was harmless. They believed what they were told, and for a while, for several years in fact, nothing seemed to be wrong at all. There is something worth understanding about radium itself, about the element at the heart of this story, before we move deeper into the lives of the women who were harmed by it. Not a lecture. There is nothing of the lecture in what we are doing here, but an understanding, quiet and considered, of what radium actually is and why its particular properties made it so terribly suited to the use to which it was put. Radium is element 88 on the periodic table. It is a heavy metal, silvery white when freshly cut, though it tarnishes quickly in air. It was the most radioactive natural substance known at the time of its discovery, 1,000,000 times more radioactive than uranium, the element from which it is ultimately derived. A single gram of radium produces roughly a calorie of heat per hour, every hour, without any external input of energy, a phenomenon that struck 19th century scientists as almost miraculous, since it appeared to violate the basic principles of thermodynamics as they understood them. What radium was actually doing, as it generated that heat and produced that glow, was decaying. Atomic decay is a process by which unstable atomic nuclei shed particles and energy in an attempt to become more stable. The particles shed by radium as it decays are called alpha particles. They're essentially the nuclei of helium atoms, stripped of their electrons, ejected from the decaying radium nucleus at high velocity. Alpha particles are, in one sense, the least penetrating form of radiation. A sheet of paper can stop them. Human skin can stop them. This is why external exposure to radium, simply being near it, or having it on the surface of your skin, is far less dangerous than internal exposure. And this is the crucial point, the point around which everything else in this story turns. Internal exposure is catastrophic. If radium is ingested, swallowed, breathed in, absorbed into the body, the alpha particles it emits are released inside living tissue, where there is no sheet of paper to stop them, no layer of skin to absorb them. They travel through the soft interior of the body, and they break the chemical bonds of whatever molecules they encounter. They destroy cells. They damage DNA. They cause, over time, the kind of cellular chaos that we now recognize as radiation sickness and cancer. And there is another property of radium that made it particularly terrible for the women on Alden Street. Radium behaves inside the human body like calcium. This is because radium is a member of the alkaline earth metals, the same chemical family as calcium, the element that forms the hard matrix of human bone. When the body encounters radium, it does not recognize it as foreign or dangerous. The same biological machinery that deposits calcium in the bones and teeth deposits radium instead, without distinction, without hesitation. So when the dial painters on Alden Street swallowed radium, a microgram at a time, a fraction of a microgram accumulated over months and years of the lip point technique, their bodies did exactly what bodies are designed to do with calcium. They stored it, in the bones, in the teeth, in the dense mineral-rich structures of the jaw. The radiation damage that followed was not immediate. It was slow, it was accumulative, and it was, by the time it began to manifest, irreversible. The bones that had stored the radium began to receive a continuous internal bombardment of alpha particles. Tiny, constant, invisible. The bone tissue attempted to repair itself. Bone is living tissue. It is perpetually rebuilding and renewing. But the repair process could not keep pace with the damage. The bone became honeycombed, weakened, prone to spontaneous fracture. In some cases, the bone simply died, a condition called radionecrosis, in which the tissue loses its blood supply and ceases to function as living matter. The jaw was particularly vulnerable. The jaw contains the teeth, and the teeth are embedded in dense alveolar bone, the same bone that had absorbed the greatest concentration of radium, since the jaw was the point of entry for every microgram that the lip point technique had introduced into the body. The teeth began to loosen. The gums became infected in ways that antibiotics, had they existed in the 1920s, which they did not, could not have addressed, because the underlying cause was not bacterial but radiological. The bone beneath the gums began to die, and then, in cases that advanced far enough, something happened that the doctors who first encountered it struggled to find language for. The jaw simply collapsed, not metaphorically, not in any literary sense. The physical structure of the lower face lost its integrity, the bone so destroyed by radiation that it could no longer maintain its form, and the flesh that had depended on that bony scaffold fell inward and downward into something that no longer resembled a human face. The physicians who examined the first cases of what they came to call radium jaw, the term that would eventually enter the medical literature, the newspapers, the public record, described their patients with a clinical precision that, in its restraint, is more terrible than any amount of dramatic description. They noted the extent of bone loss. They noted the degree of tissue necrosis. They noted, in some cases, that the jaw could be removed from the skull entirely because there was so little bone structure remaining to anchor it. This is what the glow in the factory studio was doing to the young women who thought it beautiful. But in those early years of the 1920s, none of this was yet known, or acknowledged, or even suspected by the women themselves. There was, however, at least one person who knew, or should have known. His name was Dr. Cecil Drinker, and he was a physiologist at Harvard University. In 1923, the United States Radium Corporation hired Drinker to conduct a health survey of its dial-painting workforce. This was, at the time, not an unusual thing for a large industrial employer to do. The progressive business culture of the 1920s had produced a certain interest in worker welfare. Not, it must be said, primarily out of humanitarian concern, but because healthy workers were productive workers, and the cost of high turnover and worker illness was a legitimate business problem. Drinker spent time in the orange factory. He examined workers, he took samples. He noted, with careful scientific precision, the conditions he observed. His findings were alarming. The workers showed elevated levels of radium in their tissues. They showed signs of bone abnormalities. The blood counts of many workers were markedly abnormal. Reduced numbers of red blood cells, which radium damages as it passes through the marrow where those cells are produced. Drinker's report submitted to the company concluded that the working conditions at the United States Radium Corporation posed a serious health risk to its employees. The company suppressed the report, not misplaced it, not filed it away, not disagreed with its conclusions in good faith, suppressed it. And then the company did something worse. It arranged for a revised version of the Drinker report to be produced, a version that reached the opposite conclusions, that declared the working conditions safe, that would, if published, provide the company with something close to scientific cover for whatever had happened, and whatever was still happening, on the upper floors of the Alden Street factory. Dr. Drinker himself was appalled when he discovered what had been done with his findings. He wrote to the company, he threatened legal action of his own. He eventually ensured that his original findings, his real findings, reached the public record, but the years in which the report was suppressed were years in which the lip-pointing continued, in which new workers were hired and trained in the technique and told that the paint was harmless, in which the microgram by microgram accumulation of radium in young bones continued, steady and invisible and utterly without mercy. Meanwhile, in the towns around the factory, people had begun to notice something. Young women were becoming ill, not all at once, not in any way that announced itself as a pattern at first. A woman would complain of jaw pain. Her dentist would find nothing obviously wrong. The tooth would be extracted. Another would loosen, another would be extracted. The jaw would not heal as it should. An infection would develop. The infection would be difficult to treat, would return after treatment, would become chronic, and then sometimes worse. The company, when approached by workers who were sick, responded with a consistency that can only be described as systematic. It denied that the illness was connected to the work. It pointed to the trace amounts of radium in the paint and argued that such quantities could not possibly cause harm. It suggested that the women were simply unhealthy, victims of their own poor constitutions, of the diseases that were common in poor immigrant neighborhoods. Syphilis, in some cases, was suggested, a diagnosis that carried with it enormous social stigma, and served, whether by accident or design, to discourage the affected women from pressing their claims publicly. It kept its own medical records carefully and shared them selectively, and when it could not avoid engaging with a specific case, it did so in ways calculated to minimize its legal exposure, rather than to address the suffering of the woman in front of it. This is how corporations fail people, not always with a dramatic moment of villainy, not always with a single decision that can be pointed to as the turning point, but through 1,000 small choices, each one calibrated to preserve profit and deflect responsibility, accumulated over years into a pattern of institutional harm that, in retrospect, is shattering in its completeness. The women on Alden Street were not thinking about corporate malfeasance in those early years. They were thinking about their wages and their families and the small particular pleasures of their daily lives. They were thinking about the picture show on Friday night and whether the weather would hold for Sunday's church picnic. They were painting tiny numbers onto watch dials with careful, practiced hands, and they were pointing their brushes between their lips dozens of times an hour, and they were going home at the end of the day with the faint green glow of radium still clinging to their skin. They were going home, and they were laughing about it, and they did not yet know what was already inside them. The glow was beautiful, but beauty, as the world has always known, is not always safe. History has a tendency to abstract its subjects. It speaks of workers, of employees, of populations, of cohorts, words that describe categories of human beings rather than the human beings themselves. And there is a certain usefulness to this, a necessary shorthand that allows us to talk about large patterns and structural forces without losing the thread in individual lives. But the women of the United States Radium Corporation were not a category. They were people, specific and irreducible, with names and faces and habits and desires that belonged to them alone, that no amount of historical summarizing can fully capture, but that we owe it to them to attempt. Let us begin with Grace Fryer. Grace was born in 1899, the daughter of a family that had been in New Jersey for a generation. She was, by all accounts, a young woman of considerable energy and self-possession. Not loud or aggressive, not the kind of person who drew attention for its own sake, but quietly determined, with the kind of steady inner confidence that comes from having been raised to believe that your own judgment is worth trusting. She began work at the factory on Alden Street in 1917, at the age of 18, and she was good at the work almost immediately. The lip-pointing technique came naturally to her careful hands. She was fast and precise, and her finished dials were consistently among the most accurate in the studio. She liked the work. She liked the money it provided, and she liked the daily rhythm of the studio. The familiar faces at the long tables, the low murmur of conversation, the particular satisfaction of a well-made thing. She had plans, as young women do. She was saving money. She thought, perhaps, about a room of her own, about the modest independence that a working woman of the 1920s could imagine for herself, the carefully bounded freedom of a paycheck and a key to a door. Then her teeth began to hurt. It started in 1922, a dull, persistent ache that she attributed at first to ordinary dental trouble, the kind of thing that happened to people who had grown up eating the food of immigrant neighborhoods, where sugar was cheap and dental care was expensive. She went to her dentist. The dentist extracted the offending tooth. The pain did not go away. Another tooth was extracted. The pain continued. The bone where the tooth had been did not heal as it should have. Grace Fryer spent the next several years in a growing state of physical deterioration that her doctors consistently failed to explain satisfactorily. Her jaw was examined by one physician after another. She was told she had an infection. She was told she had bone disease. She was told more than once that her condition was simply a manifestation of the general frailty of her constitution, language that was, then as now, a medical way of suggesting that a woman's suffering was somehow her own fault. She suspected, with increasing certainty, that her work at the factory was connected to her illness. But proving it was another matter entirely, and in the 1920s, a young woman from an immigrant family without money for lawyers or access to the corridors of institutional power was not well positioned to take on a corporation. Edna Hussman was another of the dial painters on Alden Street. She was a few years younger than Grace, dark-haired and quick-witted, with a laugh that her friends remembered as entirely unexpected, a short surprise sound, like she had been caught off guard by her own amusement. She lived with her parents on a street that ran parallel to the factory, close enough that she could hear the shift whistle from her bedroom window. Edna had started at the factory in 1918 and had taken to the work with the same easy competence as Grace. She was known in the studio as someone you could depend on, a worker whose output was consistent and whose presence was calming to the people around her. When new girls joined the studio, it was often Edna who showed them the technique, the angle of the brush, the pressure of the stroke, the particular intimacy of the lip point. She taught them as she had been taught, because she had been told it was safe, and she believed it, because there was no reason not to. Her jaw began to trouble her in 1923. By 1925, she had lost several teeth and was experiencing pain that she described to her doctors as constant. Not sharp, but heavy, a persistent grinding ache that was worst at night, and that no amount of rest seemed to relieve. Irene Rudolph had worked alongside Edna and Grace for several years, before she too began to notice that something was wrong. Irene was perhaps the most outwardly cheerful of the group, a young woman who seemed to approach life with a kind of determined optimism that those who knew her found both admirable and slightly mysterious, as though she had made a private decision early on that unhappiness was not something she intended to indulge. She sang while she worked, softly, under her breath, the popular songs of the day. She was engaged to be married. She was 24 years old when her hip began to fracture. Not from a fall, not from any obvious trauma, The bones simply began to give way under the ordinary pressures of a young woman's daily life. Walking, climbing stairs, the simple act of standing. A hip that was perfectly healthy should not fracture under such circumstances. A hip that has been receiving a continuous internal bombardment of alpha particles, deposited there by a body that had mistaken radium for calcium, was capable of fracturing from almost nothing. Irene's fracture did not heal properly. The bone would not knit. She underwent surgery. She underwent a second surgery. She lost the use of her leg for extended periods, and then permanently. She did not marry. Catherine Schaub, Katie, to her friends, had come to the factory at 16, not yet finished with school but old enough to work, old enough to understand that her family needed her wages. She was small and precise in her movements, someone who noticed details, who remembered things. She kept a notebook in which she wrote down over the years the names of women she knew from the factory who had become ill. The list grew. Amelia Maggia, known as Molly, had been one of the most skilled dial painters in the studio. Her dials were chosen as examples of what careful work looked like, held up to show new employees what they should aspire to. She died in 1922 at the age of 24 of what her death certificate recorded as syphilis. The syphilis diagnosis was false. It had been arrived at, or more precisely constructed, at a time when the company had reason to want its former employees' deaths attributed to causes that had nothing to do with radium. Syphilis was a disease that carried enormous social stigma. A family that accepted a syphilis diagnosis for a dead daughter was a family that would be reluctant to speak publicly about her death. A family that understood its daughter had been killed by her employer was a different kind of family entirely. The doctor who made the syphilis diagnosis was, it later emerged, connected to the United States Radium Corporation. He was not an independent physician reaching an independent conclusion. He was part of the same institutional machinery that had suppressed Cecil Drinker's health survey, that had trained its workers in a technique it knew to be dangerous, that had, for years, prioritized its profit margin over the lives of the young women who made that profit possible. Molly Mackia's body was exhumed several years after her death, at the request of her family and the lawyers who were eventually engaged in the legal cases that followed. The examination of her remains was, by any measure, a remarkable document. Her bones, those bones that had been carrying radium for years, still glowed in the dark. The radium that had killed her was still there, still decaying, still emitting its faint green-white light from within the calcium matrix of a dead woman's skeleton. This is not a metaphor. This is a fact, clinical and specific and verified by scientific examination. Molly Maggia's bones glowed in the dark. Let us hold that for a moment. Let us not rush past it in the way that historical narratives sometimes rush past their most terrible facts, as though moving quickly enough might prevent the full weight of the thing from landing. A young woman who had been 20 years old when she first learned to point her brush and draw it through her lips, who had been proud of her skill, who had died at 24, her jaw destroyed, her body consumed from within by the element she had trusted her employer's assurance about. Her bones still glowed. The glow was not beautiful anymore. It is important here to spend a moment with the lives that these women were living outside the factory, because it would be a disservice to reduce them to their suffering, to make of them simply a catalogue of symptoms and legal cases. They were people who laughed and loved and worried and hoped, and the illness that was coming for them was the backdrop against which those ordinary lives were lived, not the definition of who they were. Grace Fryer loved to dance. She went to the dance halls on Saturday nights, before the jaw pain made it hard to smile without discomfort. She liked the music of the era, the popular orchestras that played at the ballrooms and hotels, the newer jazz that was filtering through from the cities, the irresistible rhythm of a world that seemed in those early 20s years to be moving faster than anyone had anticipated. Edna Hussman read novels. She borrowed them from the public library, the same library that her working wage made it possible for her to have a card at, and she read them in the evenings after supper in the small sitting room of her parents' house, under a lamp that her father had bought with the money saved from 2 years of overtime. Katie Schaub liked to draw. She had a talent for it, a natural facility with line and proportion that she had never had the opportunity to develop formally, had never had the money for art classes or the leisure time for sustained practice. But she drew in the margins of her notebook, small, careful sketches of faces and hands and the objects on her work table, and the notebooks she kept were, in their way, a record of a particular life lived at a particular moment. These were not extraordinary women, in the sense that history usually reserves that word. They were not famous. They were not powerful. They did not move in the circles where important decisions were made. They were young women from working families in an industrial town in New Jersey, and their names were not known outside their own neighborhoods, and would not have become known at all had the company they worked for not made a series of decisions that forced them, slowly and at great cost, into the public record. They became extraordinary through suffering, and through resistance, and through the particular courage it takes to continue fighting when your own body is destroying itself from within, and the institution responsible for that destruction has more money and more lawyers and more social power than you can possibly match. But they did continue fighting, and in the end they won. There is a particular kind of historical horror that attaches to knowing, not to ignorance. Ignorance, however catastrophic its consequences, carries within it at least the possibility of absolution, but knowing and continuing, knowing and concealing, knowing and looking a sick woman in the eye and telling her that her illness has nothing to do with the work she has done for you. This is the kind of horror that belongs to the United States Radium Corporation. The corporation knew about the dangers of radium ingestion earlier than it ever admitted, and earlier than the official timeline of events suggests when it is written in the Shorthand of corporate defense. The evidence for this knowledge is extensive and has been, over the decades since the events themselves, carefully documented by historians and legal scholars and the journalists who found it necessary to return to the story of the Radium girls again and again, because the story contained things that the world needed to understand and had not yet finished understanding. Let us begin with the scientists. The United States Radium Corporation employed scientists in its laboratory on the lower floors of the Alden Street building. These were not peripheral figures. They were central to the company's operation, responsible for the research that produced the luminous paint formula, for quality control, for the ongoing development of products that the company hoped to bring to market. They were educated men, in the language of the era, trained in chemistry and physics, familiar with the properties of radium and the literature that was accumulating around those properties. They wore rubber gloves. They worked behind LED screens when handling concentrated radium preparations. They did not use the lip-pointing technique. This differential in practice, protective measures for laboratory scientists, none for dial painters, was not accidental. It was not an oversight. It was a deliberate policy that reflected a corporate judgment that the safety of scientific personnel was worth protecting, and the safety of young working-class women was not, or at least not to an extent that would cost money or reduce efficiency, or require any meaningful change in operating procedure. The scientists in the laboratory knew what radium could do to a human body. They worked with it daily. They read the same scientific literature that Marie Curie had contributed to, the literature that was increasingly documenting the effects of radium exposure on living tissue. They had, within their own building, both the expertise to understand the danger and the daily visual evidence of workers who were being exposed to that danger without protection. They said nothing, or more precisely, there is no evidence that they said anything that reached the workers upstairs, who continued to point their brushes between their lips dozens of times an hour, in complete good faith, because no one with the authority to tell them the truth had chosen to use it. The company had also been in contact in the early 1920s with industrial hygienists and medical researchers who were beginning to examine the relationship between radium exposure and worker health. This was not an obscure academic concern. It was an emerging field of practical investigation, driven by the expansion of radium-based industries and the troubling pattern of illness that was beginning to appear among workers in those industries. The correspondence between company officials and researchers is a remarkable document. It records, with a precision that is almost clinical in its own right, the process by which the corporation identified the danger, assessed its legal implications, and made a decision to manage the information in a way that served its interests rather than the interests of its workers. There were discussions about the cost of implementing protective measures, the cost of changing the painting technique, the cost of providing workers with protective equipment. These costs were compared to other costs: the cost of potential litigation, the cost of regulatory action, the cost of negative publicity, and the calculus that emerged from those comparisons produced a decision that the historical record makes impossible to misinterpret. It was cheaper to let the women be sick. This is a brutal formulation, and it is worth sitting with the brutality of it for a moment, because it is the foundation on which everything that followed was built. Every delayed diagnosis, every suppressed report, Every false cause of death inscribed on a death certificate was downstream from that original calculation. The decision was made at the level of corporate strategy, by men in offices who never sat in the dial painting studio, who never pointed a brush between their lips, who never went home with their hands glowing green in the dark. They made the decision, the women bore the cost. The lip pointing continued. In 1922, the first deaths among the Orange, New Jersey dial painters began to attract attention. Molly Maggia's death had been attributed to syphilis. Others followed, attributed to various causes that, in retrospect, share the common characteristic of redirecting attention away from radium. Ulcers, anemia, bone disease of unspecified origin. The death certificates read like a catalogue of misdirection, each one a small bureaucratic act of harm in its own right. The medical community was not entirely silent. There were physicians who examined the sick dial painters and found themselves unable to accept the diagnoses they were being offered. There were dentists who noted that the pattern of jaw destruction they were observing was unlike anything produced by ordinary disease processes. There was gradually an accumulation of professional skepticism that was harder and harder for the company to manage. And then Cecil Drinker submitted his report. We have mentioned Drinker already, the Harvard physiologist hired by the company to conduct a health survey of its workers, whose findings were alarming, whose report was suppressed, and who eventually ensured that his findings reached the public record. But the full story of the Drinker report is worth dwelling on, because it illustrates, with exceptional clarity, the process by which corporate institutions convert scientific knowledge into strategic assets. Drinker's original report, submitted to the company in 1924, was unambiguous. The blood counts of workers showed abnormalities consistent with radiation exposure. The bones of workers showed changes consistent with radiation damage. The technique of lip pointing was, in Drinker's professional judgment, a source of significant radium ingestion, and significant radium ingestion was, in the light of the available scientific evidence, a serious health hazard. He recommended immediate changes to workplace practice. The lip pointing technique should be abandoned. Workers should be given alternative methods for maintaining brush points. Protective measures should be implemented in the painting studio. The health of current and former workers should be monitored. These recommendations were not complex. They were not technologically difficult to implement. They would have cost the company money, some in equipment, some in slightly reduced efficiency, some in the management attention required to change and establish practice. But they were entirely feasible, and had they been implemented in 1924, they would have prevented years of additional harm. The company did not implement them. Instead, it produced the revised report, the false report, the document that reached the opposite conclusions from the one that Drinker had actually written, that declared the working conditions safe, that would have provided the company with a scientific imprimatur for its continued failure to protect its workers. Drinker, when he discovered what had been done, was furious. His correspondence from this period reflects a man caught between the conventions of his professional world, which did not readily accommodate open confrontation with powerful industrial clients, and a growing conviction that what he had witnessed was indefensible. He wrote to the company. He made clear that he would not allow his name to be attached to findings he had not reached. He took steps to ensure that his original report reached the researchers and public health officials who needed to see it. This was not nothing. Drinker's insistence on the integrity of his own findings was an act of professional courage in a context where professional courage was not the easy choice. But it also came after years of delay, and the years in which the company had managed its exposure to Drinker's real findings were years in which the painting studios continued to operate, in which the lip pointing continued, in which the microgram by microgram accumulation of radium in the bones of workers continued without interruption. The knowledge existed, the harm continued. By 1925, the pattern of illness among the dial painters was beginning to attract the attention of journalists. The medical cases were unusual enough, and concentrated enough in a specific population of young women working at a specific factory, that the clustering was increasingly difficult to explain away. Reporters began asking questions. Editors began assigning stories. The company's response to press attention was as carefully managed as its response to medical scrutiny. Spokespeople emphasized the safety of the product. They pointed to workers who were healthy, and there were healthy workers, particularly among those who had joined the studio more recently and had not yet accumulated sufficient radium to manifest symptoms. They questioned the motives of the journalists who were asking uncomfortable questions. They suggested, in some cases directly and in some cases through intermediaries, that the story of sick dial painters was being exaggerated by people with agendas. This strategy of managed denial, deployed across medical, scientific and media fronts simultaneously, was sophisticated and effective in the short term. It delayed the public reckoning that was coming. It prevented regulatory action for years that, had they been years of action rather than inaction, might have saved lives or at least preserved some quality of life for women who were already sick. But it could not hold forever. Because the women themselves were still alive, most of them, still sick, still in pain, still losing teeth and function and years of their lives, but alive and becoming, slowly and with increasing determination, something that the corporation had not anticipated and could not easily manage. They were becoming witnesses. They were becoming the kind of witnesses who had names and faces and the capacity to speak in public, whose suffering was visible and undeniable, who could look a journalist or a judge or a jury in the eye and describe in plain language exactly what had been done to them and exactly what they knew about who had known it would happen. The company had spent years managing information. It had not spent enough time thinking about what happens when the people whose stories you have been managing decide to tell those stories themselves. Grace Fryer decided to sue in 1927. It had taken her years to reach that decision, not because she lacked conviction, but because the path from conviction to legal action for a young working-class woman without financial resources in 1920s New Jersey was genuinely difficult. Lawyers cost money. Cases required evidence. Evidence required access to documents and expert witnesses that were, in the normal course of things, beyond the reach of an individual without institutional support. And there was another obstacle, more fundamental than money. The statute of limitations. Under New Jersey law at the time, personal injury claims had to be filed within 2 years of the injury occurring. This was a standard provision of tort law, designed to ensure that cases were brought while evidence was fresh and witnesses were available. It was a reasonable provision when applied to injuries that were immediately apparent: a broken leg, a burn, a wound. It was a catastrophic provision when applied to injuries that were slow and accumulative and did not manifest for years after the exposure that caused them. By the time Grace and her colleagues understood what had happened to them, by the time the connection between their work and their illnesses was clear enough to act on, the 2-year window had, in a strict legal reading, already closed. This was not accidental. The years of managed denial, the false diagnoses, the suppressed reports, all of it had served, among other purposes, to delay the moment at which the affected women understood clearly enough what had been done to them to bring a legal case. And every year of delay was another year of statute running, another year of legal protection for the corporation. To bring a case, Grace needed a lawyer willing to argue that the statute should be interpreted differently, that for an injury that was by its nature slow and hidden and not immediately apparent, the 2-year window should begin not at the moment of exposure but at the moment of discovery. This was not a radical legal theory, but it was not established law either. It was an argument that a judge would have to accept, and accepting it would require judicial courage, since it would mean expanding the liability of a corporation in a manner that the corporation's lawyers would strenuously resist. Finding a lawyer willing to make that argument, and willing to do so on contingency, accepting payment only if the case succeeded, took time and repeated failure. Most attorneys Grace approached declined. The case was expensive to prepare. The defendant was well-funded and well-connected. The legal theory was untested. The probability of success was, at best, uncertain. Eventually, a lawyer named Raymond Berry agreed to take the case. Berry was not a flashy attorney. He was not a courtroom showman or a celebrity litigator. He was a methodical and careful lawyer who had looked at the evidence Grace brought him and reached the conclusion that what had been done to her and the other women was wrong legally and morally, and that the case was worth fighting even at the cost of years of difficult and uncertain work. He took 5 clients: Grace Fryer, Edna Hussman, Irene Rudolph, Catherine Schaub, and Quinta MacDonald. The 5 women became known, in the press coverage that followed, as the Radium Girls, a name that was applied initially in the tabloid shorthand of 1920s journalism, and that has remained attached to them in historical memory. The lawsuit was filed in May of 1927. The defendant was the United States Radium Corporation. What followed was not a swift or clean legal victory. It was a protracted battle that lasted nearly a year and a half, that tested the physical and emotional endurance of 5 women who were already suffering, and that produced, in the court of public opinion, if not always in the courtroom itself, a reckoning with questions about corporate responsibility and worker safety that the legal system of the era was not fully equipped to answer. The company's legal strategy, from the first filing, was delay. Motions were filed, hearings were scheduled and rescheduled, documents that Berry requested in discovery were produced slowly, incompletely, with objections and appeals that ate months of court time. The corporation's lawyers were skilled, well-resourced, and entirely focused on running out the clock, both the literal clock of the statute of limitations arguments and the more terrible clock of the women's declining health. Because the company knew, and Berry knew, that Grace and her colleagues were not getting better. They were getting worse. Every month of delay was a month of continued deterioration. Every postponed hearing was a hearing at which the plaintiffs were a little weaker, a little less able to endure the physical ordeal of a courtroom appearance, a little closer to the point at which they would no longer be alive to testify. The company was, in the most literal possible sense, waiting for them to die. This calculation was not concealed. The company's lawyers stated openly, in correspondence that Berry eventually obtained and made public, that the company's preferred outcome was for the cases to be resolved through the deaths of the plaintiffs rather than through a court judgment. Dead plaintiffs could not testify. Dead plaintiffs' families could not pursue claims as vigorously as living ones. The liability of a settled death claim was, in the company's calculation, considerably easier to manage than the liability of a living woman on a witness stand describing, in her own words, what had been done to her. When this calculation became public, through Berry's careful management of press relationships, and through the sheer compelling horror of what it represented, the case moved from a local industrial dispute into a national news story. The newspapers took it up with an attention that reflected genuine public outrage. Editorials were written. Columnists who had built their audiences on exactly this kind of corporate malfeasance story recognized what they had been given and used it well. The juxtaposition, healthy young working women poisoned by their employer, watching their own faces dissolve while the company's lawyers filed motions to delay, produced a narrative that was simultaneously heartbreaking and infuriating, a combination that is, in journalistic terms, about as effective as any combination gets. The 5 plaintiffs had, by the time the case attracted national attention, become physically diminished in ways that the newspapers reported in detail. Grace Fryer, who had once danced on Saturday nights, could no longer stand for extended periods. Her jaw had been fitted with a brace, a crude contraption of metal and leather that held the remnants of her lower face in alignment, since the bone structure that should have provided that alignment was no longer adequate to do so. Irene Rudolph was confined to a wheelchair. Catherine Schaub, the one who kept the notebooks, wrote letters to Berry from her bed on days when she was too weak to come to his office. The press photographed them. It would be wrong to say they welcomed the attention in any simple sense. The attention came at a cost, requiring them to present their diminished bodies to photographers and reporters when they were already exhausted and in pain. But they understood, with a clarity that is remarkable given how sick they were, that publicity was one of the few instruments of power they had available to them, and they used it deliberately and skillfully. Grace in particular gave interviews that were models of controlled, precise statement. No self-pity, no dramatic excess, no language that could be dismissed as hysterical. She described facts. She described what she'd been told and what she now knew. She described the gap between those two things, and she let the gap speak for itself. The public responded. By 1928, the case had attracted enough attention that politicians were beginning to involve themselves, less from a pure concern for the 5 plaintiffs than from the recognition that the questions raised by the case had implications far beyond the factory on Alden Street. If an employer could knowingly expose workers to a substance that it had been told was dangerous, suppress the evidence of that danger, and then use the legal system to delay accountability until the affected workers were dead, if all of that was possible within the existing legal and regulatory framework, then something was fundamentally wrong with that framework. New Jersey legislators introduced bills to address the statute of limitations problem that Berry had identified. Federal officials began asking questions about the oversight of radium use in industrial settings. The industrial hygiene community, which had for years been producing academic papers about radium's effects on workers with limited practical impact, found its concerns suddenly elevated to a public stage, and the company, faced with the combined pressure of public attention, political scrutiny, and a legal case that showed no signs of simply going away, began, slowly and reluctantly, to negotiate. The settlement that eventually emerged from those negotiations was reached in June of 1928. It provided each of the 5 plaintiffs with a lump sum of $10,000, a significant amount, though not a transformative one, given the lifetime of medical costs they faced. It also provided an annuity of $600 per year for as long as they lived, and agreed to pay their medical expenses going forward. It was not by any measure full justice. $10,000 was not adequate compensation for what had been done to these women. The annuity was not adequate to the needs of women who were likely to require significant medical care for the rest of their lives, however long or short those lives might be. But the settlement was public, and the terms were public, and the fact of the settlement was, in itself, an acknowledgement, however partial and legally qualified, that something had been done to these women by the company they had worked for, and the settlement, and the public attention that surrounded it, had consequences that extended far beyond the 5 plaintiffs. The case became a touchstone for the emerging labour rights movement, for the developing field of occupational health law, for the arguments that were being made, and that would continue to be made for decades, about the responsibility of employers toward their workers and the right of workers to know about the hazards of their work. It changed the law, directly, measurably, specifically. New Jersey extended its statute of limitations for occupational disease cases in response to the advocacy that the Radium girls case generated. Federal occupational safety standards were tightened. The scientific and regulatory framework around the industrial use of radioactive materials was substantially reformed. These changes saved lives, not the lives of Grace and Edna and Irene and Catherine and Kinta. Those lives had already been altered in ways that nothing could now undo. But the lives of other workers in other factories who encountered other hazards and who now had legal and regulatory protections that had not existed before 5 women from Orange, New Jersey, decided that what had been done to them was worth fighting. The women were still sick. They were still losing bone and function and time, but they had won something, and the something they had won was real, even if it was imperfect, and it mattered. The story did not end in New Jersey. It never ends where it begins. The forces that produce harm on the scale that the United States Radium Corporation produced, it do not operate in isolation, in a single factory in a single town. They operate across an industry, across a geography, across the full extent of the market that makes the harm profitable. And in the 1920s, the luminous dial industry extended well beyond Alden Street in Orange. In Ottawa, Illinois, a small town on the Fox River, an hour southwest of Chicago, another luminous dial factory had been operating since 1918. The Radium Dial Company was independent of the United States Radium Corporation, but used the same product, the same technique, and crucially the same approach to worker safety, which is to say no approach at all. The workers in Ottawa were, like their counterparts in New Jersey, mostly young women from the local community. They worked in a studio not unlike the one on Alden Street, long tables, careful brushwork, the same luminous paint, the same lip-pointing technique. They were told, as the New Jersey women had been told, that the paint was safe, that the radium in it was so diluted as to pose no hazard, that the scientists who handled concentrated radium elsewhere in the building were being overcautious. The Ottawa workers were, if anything, even more thoroughly deceived than the New Jersey workers had been. The Radium Dial Company had the benefit of watching what happened to the Orange factory over the course of the 1920s, the growing illness among workers, the Cecil Drinker report, the legal case brought by Grace Fryer and her colleagues. It had, in other words, more information about the danger than the New Jersey factory's management had possessed when the first workers were hired, and it continued the practice. The women in Ottawa who are part of this story have their own names, their own specificities, their own lives that were lived outside the dial painting studio. Catherine Wolfe Donahue is the most prominent of them in the historical record, not because her suffering was uniquely severe, though it was severe enough, but because she was, like Grace Fryer in New Jersey, a person of particular determination and clarity who understood that her own story was also, in some important sense, everyone's story. Catherine had grown up in Ottawa, the daughter of an Irish immigrant family, raised Catholic in a town where the church was the centre of community life, and the rhythms of the liturgical year provided the framework around which everything else was organised. She had married a man named Tom Donahue, a steady, devoted husband who would, over the years of Catherine's illness, take on an increasingly active role in her fight against the company. She had started at the Radium Dial Company in 1922 at the age of 18, and she had been, by her own account and the accounts of those who worked with her, very good at the work. She was methodical and careful, the kind of worker who noticed when something was slightly off and corrected it before it became a problem. She pointed her brush between her lips the way everyone did. By 1931, she'd begun to notice what the women in New Jersey had begun to notice a decade earlier. The jaw pain, the loosening teeth, the infections that would not resolve, the bone that would not heal where teeth had been extracted. She went to her doctor. She was told various things, none of them the truth. She went to another doctor. Same. The Radium Dial Company, when she raised concerns about her health, told her what the United States Radium Corporation had told its workers, that the paint was safe, that her illness was unrelated to her work, that she was simply unfortunate in her constitution. Catherine Donahue had the benefit of the New Jersey case. She had read the newspaper coverage. She knew what had happened to Grace Fryer and the others, and she recognized, with the particular painful clarity of a person who is living through something she has already read about, what was happening to her. She was not alone in Ottawa. There were other women at the Radium Dial Company who were sick, who were experiencing the same jaw pain and tooth loss and bone deterioration, who were being told the same lies. They found each other, as people in the same circumstances tend to do. Through shared doctors, through community networks, through the simple fact of living in a small town where everyone knew everyone, and secrets of the kind the company was trying to keep were harder to maintain. The group that formed around Catherine Donahue, sometimes called the Ottawa Radium Girls in the historical literature to distinguish them from the New Jersey Five, was in some ways in a more difficult position than Grace Fryer's group had been. They were later in the progression of their illness, some of them. The legal landscape had changed as a result of the New Jersey settlement, which was an improvement in some respects, but had also taught the company's legal team new tactics. And they were in Illinois, not New Jersey, which meant a different set of courts, a different set of legal precedents, a different set of obstacles. They found lawyers. They filed suit. The Radium Dial Company responded with the same strategy its eastern counterpart had employed. Delay, denial, request for further medical examination by company-appointed doctors who reliably produced findings favourable to the company, motions and appeals designed to extend the time before any case came to trial. The statute of limitations issue arose again, in a form even more acute than it had been in New Jersey. The Illinois courts had to grapple with the same fundamental question. When does the clock start running on a harm that was done years before the victim understood that it had been done? Catherine Donahue's case eventually came to an industrial commission hearing in 1937, 15 years after she had begun working at the factory. By that point, she was severely ill. She came to the hearing in a wheelchair, brought on a stretcher. She testified from a recumbent position, too weak to sit upright. Her husband sat beside her, as he had sat beside her through years of medical appointments and legal proceedings, and the long, difficult nights when the pain was worst and the future was hardest to contemplate. She testified with precision and clarity. She described her work. She described the technique she had been taught. She described what she had been told about the safety of the paint and what she now knew about the accuracy of those assurances. She described the progression of her illness in terms that left no room for the alternative explanations the company's lawyers had been advancing for years. The commission found in her favour. The company appealed. The appeals process continued as Catherine's health deteriorated. There were months when the outcome of the appeal was uncertain, when it was genuinely unclear whether the legal victory she had won at the commission level would survive the pressure the company was applying at the appellate level. She died in July of 1938 before the final resolution of her case. Tom Donahue pursued it for her. The Illinois Supreme Court ultimately upheld the commission's finding. The ruling was issued in 1939, more than a year after Catherine's death. Tom received the settlement that had been awarded to his wife, a modest sum by any reckoning that could not begin to address the financial and human cost of what had been done to Catherine and to him, but the ruling was more than money. It was a legal precedent that extended occupational disease protections, that clarified the statute of limitations question for slow-developing occupational illness, that established in the law of Illinois something that Catherine Donahue had established in her life and in her death, that what had been done to the dial painters was wrong, and that the corporations responsible for doing it were legally liable for the harm they had caused. The Illinois case, like the New Jersey case, rippled outward. It informed subsequent litigation. It strengthened the arguments of labour advocates. It became part of the foundation on which the modern framework of occupational health law was built, a framework that, for all its imperfections, has prevented suffering on a scale that is difficult to quantify but is real. Other women had worked at the Radium dial company. Not all of them had joined the legal fight. Some had died before understanding what had killed them. Some had been diagnosed with false causes of death, their records amended by physicians whose relationship with the company had compromised their independence. Some had simply accepted what they were told, out of exhaustion or poverty, or the reasonable fear that a working-class woman in 1930s Illinois had of the power that a corporation could bring to bear on anyone who challenged it. In Ottawa, there is a cemetery where several of the Radium dial workers are buried. For decades after their deaths, the ground around their graves retained a faint radioactivity, detectable by instruments placed close to the soil. The radium that had been deposited in their bones during the years of dial painting was still there, still decaying at the steady, remorseless pace that the physics of radioactive decay imposes on the elements. Time measures things differently than people do. A human life unfolds over decades. Radium-226, the specific isotope that was used in the luminous paint, has a half-life of 1600 years. By the physics of the element, the radium that was deposited in the bones of the dial painters in the 1920s is essentially unchanged. The same substance, in essentially the same quantity, still decaying, still emitting its faint and deadly particles. The women are long dead. The glow, in some sense, continues. There is something in that fact that resists easy emotional processing. It is too large for grief, too specific for abstraction. It simply is, a physical fact about the world, as neutral and indifferent as the periodic table from which it derives. But we are not neutral and indifferent. That is the difference between physics and history. Physics describes what is. History asks what it means, and whether it was necessary and whether it could have been otherwise. The radium in the Ottawa cemetery did not have to be there. The women it killed did not have to be killed. The decisions that put the radium in their bodies were made by human beings who had other options, who had information they chose not to act on, who weighed the cost of protecting their workers against the cost of not protecting them and found the second acceptable. That is not physics, that is a moral fact, and moral facts endure. While the legal battles were being fought in the courts of New Jersey and Illinois, another battle was proceeding in laboratories and lecture halls and the pages of medical journals. A slower battle, quieter, conducted in the language of data and methodology rather than testimony and argument, but one that was in its own way equally consequential. The science of radiation safety was, in the 1920s, a developing field. This is not to excuse the people who chose to ignore what was already known. We have established that knowledge was available, that it was suppressed, that the ignorance that was pleaded in the defense of the corporations was, in significant part, manufactured. But it is worth understanding the state of scientific knowledge at the time, because the story of how that knowledge developed is part of the story of how the harm done to the Radium girls eventually became legible to the world in a way that made change possible. Marie Curie had understood by the early 1900s that radium had effects on living tissue. She had observed burns on her own skin, the erythema produced by prolonged contact with radium sources. She had noted the fatigue and the ailments that accumulated through years of working with radioactive materials. She had, in her private correspondence, expressed concerns about her health that she did not fully voice in her public scientific writings, but the connection between radium exposure and the specific cascade of harm that it produced, the bone destruction, the anemia, the cascading cellular damage, was not established in the scientific literature with the precision and authority needed to drive regulatory action until after the dial painter cases had already made the question urgent. It was, in some sense, the dial painters who made the science happen. The pattern of illness they represented, specific, concentrated, associated with a specific occupational exposure, was the kind of natural experiment that epidemiology depends on. Before the dial painter cases, the evidence for internal radium poisoning was scattered and uncertain. After the cases, with the medical records of hundreds of affected workers available for systematic analysis, the evidence became overwhelming. The scientists who did this work deserve recognition in their own right. Harrison Martland, the medical examiner of Essex County in New Jersey, was among the first to connect the pattern of illness among dial painters to radium exposure in published scientific literature. His papers from the mid-1920s, peer-reviewed, carefully documented, publicly accessible in the way that scientific publication is designed to ensure, provided the evidentiary foundation that the legal cases depended on and that subsequent regulatory action drew from. Martland examined the bodies of workers who had died. He measured the radium content of their bones. He documented the specific pathology of radium-induced bone destruction in detail that allowed clinicians to recognize the condition and gave lawyers the expert testimony they needed to make cases. He was not the only scientist working in this space, but he was among the most important, and his work illustrates a principle about the relationship between harm and knowledge that is worth articulating. The harm had to be large enough and public enough and concentrated enough in a specific identifiable population before the scientific machinery of epidemiology and pathology could engage with it fully. This is not an argument for accepting harm as the price of knowledge. It is an observation about how scientific investigation actually proceeds in the real world, where resources are finite and attention is directed by urgency, and where urgency is itself shaped by social and political forces. The dial painter cases created urgency. The urgency produced investigation. The investigation produced knowledge. The knowledge produced change. This was not how it should have worked. It should have worked the other way: knowledge, then protection, then safety. But it is how it did work, and understanding how it did work is part of understanding how to build systems that work better. The physical examinations of the dial painters themselves, in the years when they were alive and seeking medical attention, produced their own scientific record. The techniques for measuring radium in living bodies were developed partly in response to the needs of this specific population. The use of electroscopes and ionization chambers to detect the emanations from radium-bearing bones was refined through the study of dial painter cases. The understanding of the biological half-life of radium in the body, how long it stayed, how it was distributed across different bone types, how it moved through the body's metabolic processes, was built largely on data gathered from the workers who'd been involuntarily exposed. There is something uncomfortable about this. The scientific knowledge that now allows us to understand radium's effects on the human body was built, in significant part, from the suffering of women who were never asked for their consent and who received nothing in exchange for the data their bodies provided except, in many cases, inadequate medical care and a legal settlement that arrived too late to matter. This discomfort is appropriate. It should not be resolved. The knowledge is real, and it has value, and it has been used to protect people who would otherwise have been harmed. But it was extracted at a cost that should never have been necessary, from people who deserve to be protected rather than studied. The development of radiation protection standards in the decades following the dial painter cases drew directly on the knowledge produced by those cases. The first radiation protection guidelines issued by the National Bureau of Standards in the late 1920s and early 1930s were shaped by what had been learned from the dial painters. The concept of a maximum permissible dose, the idea that there is a quantifiable limit to the amount of radiation a person can receive without unacceptable risk of harm, was developed in the context of the industrial radium experience. These standards were not perfect. They were in fact revised repeatedly as understanding of radiation biology improved, and some of the early standards set limits that were still far higher than we now understand to be safe. The history of radiation protection is, in this respect, not a clean story of linear progress toward correct understanding. It is a more complicated story of imperfect knowledge, practical compromise, and the ongoing tension between the demands of industry and the requirements of safety. But the standards existed. They were published. They had the authority of scientific institutions behind them, and they created a framework within which workers could, if the framework was properly enforced, be protected from the harms that the dial painters had suffered. The enforcement was imperfect. The history of occupational health regulation is full of examples of standards that were established and then inadequately enforced, of industry exemptions and regulatory capture, and the persistent tendency of the agencies charged with protecting workers to become more responsive to the industries they regulated than to the workers those regulations were meant to protect. But the framework existed. And the framework existed in significant part because 5 women from Orange, New Jersey and their counterparts in Ottawa, Illinois, had refused to accept the proposition that what had been done to them was simply the way things were. Outside the formal scientific and regulatory world, the dial painter cases were having another effect, one that is harder to measure but may be equally important. They were changing the way ordinary people thought about the relationship between industrial work and safety. The Radium Girl story reached a broad public at a time when that public was already developing, through the labour movement and the progressive politics of the era, a new understanding of workers as people with rights rather than simply inputs to an industrial process. The specific horror of what had been done, the glow, the jaw, the suppressed reports, the company waiting for its workers to die, was legible to any person who read a newspaper. It was a horror that did not require scientific literacy to understand. You did not need to know what an alpha particle was to understand that a company had told its workers that poison was safe, and had done so in full knowledge of the truth, and had then spent years using the legal system to avoid accountability for the consequences. That understanding, distributed across the newspaper-reading public of the late 1920s and 1930s, contributed to a political environment in which demands for regulatory protection of workers were harder to dismiss, in which the argument that industry could regulate itself was harder to make, in which the people who were making those arguments faced a more sceptical public than they would have faced otherwise. The dial painters did not set out to change the world. They set out, most of them, simply to survive, to obtain some measure of justice, to ensure that what had been done to them was acknowledged, to find some way of making the years of suffering mean something beyond themselves. In this limited and personal goal, they were not entirely successful. The suffering remained. The years were not given back. The faces that had been destroyed by radium were not restored by settlement checks. But in the larger goal that their fight made possible, in the framework of protection that their cases helped to build, in the precedents that their lawyers established, in the political environment that their stories helped to create, they had done something that mattered far beyond their own lives. They had, in the language of the era's labour movement, made the world slightly safer for workers who came after them. And the workers who came after them, the millions of people who have worked in industrial settings over the decades since the 1920s, in conditions that are safer because of regulatory frameworks that were built partly on the foundations that the Radium girls helped to establish, are the living beneficiaries of that work whether they know it or not. Most of them do not know it. That is the nature of protective infrastructure. It works by preventing harm that would otherwise occur, and harm that has been prevented leaves no trace in the world. You do not feel the cancer you did not get, or mourn the years you did not lose, or grieve for the family that was not destroyed by an occupational disease that was stopped before it reached you. The protection is invisible. The people who created it are forgotten. The women who pointed their brushes between their lips on Alden Street in 1917 are not household names, but they are here, in this story, and in the stories of everyone who has worked safely in a world that was made a little safer by their refusal to accept that what had been done to them was acceptable. There is a woman named Margaret Rossiter who appears only briefly in the historical record of the dial painter cases, but whose brief appearance is, in its way, as telling as any of the larger stories we have been following. Margaret worked at the United States Radium Corporation in Orange during the early 1920s. She was not among the 5 women who became plaintiffs in the 1927 lawsuit. She was not prominent in the press coverage. She did not give the interviews that Grace Fryer gave, or keep the notebooks that Katie Schaub kept, but she was among the workers who underwent physical examination at a certain point in the early 1920s as part of an effort to document the health of the workforce. And the record of her examination, in the clinical impersonal language that medical records use for everyone regardless of what they mean, notes that she exhaled radon. Radon is a radioactive gas, a decay product of radium. When radium is deposited in the bones, one of its decay products, radium-226 decays through a chain of intermediate elements before reaching stable lead, is radon, a noble gas that is not bound chemically to anything and moves freely through tissue. Radon produced in the bones diffuses into the blood and is carried to the lungs, where it is exhaled. A person who has absorbed enough radium breathes out radon with every breath. Margaret Rossiter exhaled radon. Her body was so saturated with the element she had ingested through years of lip pointing that the radioactive gas was measurable in her exhalations. She breathed radium out. It had become part of her respiratory cycle, part of the most basic involuntary function of her living body. The clinical record notes this finding without evident emotion. It is a data point among other data points, but as a human fact, as a thing that happened to a person who had simply gone to work, it is staggering. We speak easily in history about what institutions did to people. We speak of corporate decisions and regulatory failures and legal strategies. These are the appropriate units of analysis for understanding the structure of an event like the Radium Girl story. But the story also has a body, many bodies, and the experience of those bodies is something that the structural analysis can only partially capture. The experience of waking every morning to jaw pain that was never fully absent. The experience of feeling a tooth loosen that should not have been loose. The small horror of pressing your tongue against it and feeling the slight give, the terrible knowledge that came with that give. The experience of visiting a doctor and being told again that your illness was not what you knew it to be, that the connection you had drawn was incorrect, that you should be patient, that you should rest. The experience of looking in a mirror and not seeing your own face as it had been. These are experiences that the historical record documents in the dry language of legal testimony and medical notation. They are experiences that the women themselves described, when they described them at all, in language that was careful and controlled. The language of people who understood that the only way to be taken seriously in the institutional spaces they were navigating was to suppress the parts of their experience that might be dismissed as too emotional, too personal, too subjective to constitute legitimate evidence. Grace Fryer, in her interviews with journalists, almost never described her pain directly. She described facts. She described the sequence of events. She described what she had been told and what she now knew. The pain was there, behind the facts. You can feel it in the spaces between the sentences, in the things that are not said, in the particular quality of precision that belongs to someone who has learned that precision is their best protection against being dismissed. But she did not say, "I am in pain. I was beautiful once, and I'm not beautiful now. I was going to dance on Saturday nights for the rest of my life, and instead, I'm sitting in a courtroom in a jaw brace, talking to lawyers about the molecular properties of an element I never asked to be poisoned by." She did not say those things, she said facts, and the facts won. The question of the body, of what it means to live in a body that has been altered, permanently and irreversibly, by harm done by another, is one that the legal and regulatory frameworks built in response to the Radium Girls cases do not fully address. They address liability, they address compensation, they address the prevention of future harm. They do not address the experience of living in a changed body, of knowing that the change is permanent, of making a life within constraints that were imposed on you without your knowledge or consent. The women who survived long enough to collect their settlements had to build lives inside those settlements. They had to find ways of living that worked for them in their actual physical conditions, not the conditions they had imagined for themselves at 18, when they first sat down at the long tables in the dial painting studio and learned to point a brush. Some of them managed this with what I can only describe as extraordinary grace, though grace is perhaps the wrong word. It implies an ease that none of them had. Call it persistence instead. The persistence of people who have decided that the harm done to them does not get to define the rest of their lives, even when it defines their bodies. Katie Schaub continued to draw for as long as her hands allowed it. The notebook she kept during the legal proceedings contained sketches alongside the legal notes. Small, careful drawings of faces and objects, and the specific New Jersey light of particular seasons. She was documenting something, her own persistence, the world continuing to exist and to be worth noticing. Grace Fryer, whose jaw brace became one of the iconic images of the legal proceedings, went on living, carefully within the constraints of her health, for years after the settlement. She was not cured. The radium in her bones continued to decay, the damage continued to accumulate. But she was alive, and she had won something, and she knew she had won something, and that knowledge was, by whatever measure she found adequate, sufficient. The Illinois women, Catherine Donahue among them, faced an additional dimension of difficulty that the New Jersey women had not quite encountered in the same way. Catherine's case proceeded after her death, carried forward by her husband, which meant that the final legal reckoning happened in her absence. Tom Donahue attended hearings that Catherine should have attended. He received a settlement that Catherine should have received. He went home to a house that no longer contained his wife. He kept going. He made sure the case was won. He was, by the accounts that survive, not a man who sought recognition for this. He had done it because it was what needed doing, and because Catherine had started it, and finishing it was his responsibility to her. These are not stories that resolve neatly. They do not end with triumph in the courtroom and everyone going home satisfied. They end with women who are still sick, with settlements that are inadequate, with legal precedents that matter but do not undo the harm, with knowledge that came too late for the people who paid the highest price for its production. And yet there is something in these stories that is not despair, that resists despair, actively and deliberately. The women who fought, Grace, Edna, Irene, Katie, Quinta, Catherine and the others in Ottawa, fought in full knowledge of what they were fighting from. They were sick when they decided to sue. They were getting sicker during the years the cases dragged on. They knew, with varying degrees of explicitness, that they might not live to see the outcome. They fought anyway. This is not a simple thing. It is not reducible to heroism, which is a word that has been polished too smooth by use to carry much weight. Call it something more specific. The refusal to accept that harm done in secret is harm that must stay secret. The refusal to be managed into silence by the combination of institutional power and personal diminishment. The understanding that their own cases mattered beyond themselves, and the willingness to act on that understanding at great personal cost. The world does not have a good enough word for this. The closest thing might simply be, they were right, and they knew they were right, and they acted accordingly. In the years since the Radium girls' cases became part of the historical record, there have been efforts to remember them in ways that are adequate to what they did. The book by Kate Moore, published in 2017, brought their stories to a new and substantial readership, a book that is careful and detailed and written with the kind of attention to individual lives that history at its best requires. There have been plays and films and museum exhibitions. There is a memorial in Ottawa near the site of the former Radium dial factory. But the most enduring memorial is not a monument. It is the regulatory and legal framework that was built in part on their cases. It is the concept of the employer's duty of care toward workers. It is the principle that a worker's right to know about the hazards of their work is not a favour granted by a benevolent employer, but a legal entitlement. It is the statute of limitations reform that ensures that workers who suffer from slowly developing occupational diseases are not denied legal recourse by the simple fact of their illness's delayed manifestation. These are not romantic memorials. They are not the kind of thing you can point to and say, "There, look. That is for Grace and Edna and Irene and Katie and Quinta and Catherine and all the others." But they are real. They are functional. They protect people. The people they protect will never know whose fight made their protection possible. But we know, and knowing matters. There is a temptation, when telling a story like this one, to treat its historical moment as its container, to say that this is a story about the 1920s, about a particular industry in a particular time, about conditions that no longer exist and cannot recur. The luminous dial industry using radium paint is gone. The specific corporate entities responsible for the harm done to the Radium girls have ceased to exist. The legal and regulatory frameworks have changed, but the pattern is not gone. The pattern, by which I mean the specific sequence of events through which corporate knowledge of industrial harm is managed, suppressed and deployed against the interests of the workers experiencing that harm, is a pattern that has recurred in different industries and different materials and different decades, with a consistency that is itself a fact worth confronting. The asbestos industry provides the most direct parallel. The story of asbestos exposure, worker illness, corporate knowledge, suppression, and eventual litigation has a structure so similar to the Radium Girl story that a historian working on either one inevitably finds themselves drawing the comparison. Corporate documents emerged in asbestos litigation decades after the harm was done that showed knowledge of the danger at levels of corporate hierarchy far above the shop floor, knowledge that was managed as the radium knowledge was managed through denial, misdirection, and the weaponization of the legal system against sick workers who were trying to understand what had killed them. The tobacco industry, the lead industry, the PFAS, per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, that have been found in the groundwater of towns near manufacturing facilities, the subject of ongoing litigation that is, in its structure, recognizably similar to the dial painter cases. The pattern is not unique to any particular substance or any particular era. It belongs to a specific kind of institutional relationship between profit and harm, a relationship in which the people who generate the profit are insulated from the harm by legal structures, physical distance, and the ability to manage information in ways that the people bearing the harm cannot match. The Radium Girls cases did not end this pattern. They could not have ended it. No single case, however significant, can restructure the fundamental incentive systems of industrial capitalism. What they did was contribute to a body of legal and regulatory knowledge that makes the pattern slightly harder to execute and slightly less profitable when it is executed and eventually exposed. This is not nothing. Progress in the prevention of institutional harm tends to be of this character: incremental, partial, requiring constant renewal and defense, never arriving at a final destination of complete protection. Each generation of reformers works against the same tendencies, using tools that were built in earlier battles and that must be maintained, because the forces they were built to contain are persistent and well-funded, and not interested in being contained. The women on Alden Street were part of this longer project without knowing it. They were doing something local and specific, trying to survive, trying to get justice, trying to ensure that what had been done to them was acknowledged. They were not thinking in terms of historical legacy. They were thinking about their health and their families and the painful, grinding work of pursuing a legal case while their bodies continued to fail. But the local and specific action they took had structural consequences. It added a layer of protection to the framework that exists to prevent similar things from happening to other people. That layer is real, it is functional, it is part of the world. There is another thread in the longer shadow of the Radium Girl story that deserves attention, and it concerns the place of women in the institutional spaces where these events unfolded. The dial painters were women, and their gender was not incidental to what happened to them. The specific form of vulnerability they experienced, the vulnerability of workers who are told that their health concerns are exaggerated, whose physical symptoms are attributed to their own constitutional weakness, who are offered syphilis diagnoses designed to silence them through shame, who face the legal system as individuals without institutional backing against a well-resourced corporate defendant, was shaped by their gender in ways that are impossible to separate from the rest of the story. The physicians who delivered false diagnoses were operating in a medical culture that had, for most of its history, treated women's bodies as less reliable witnesses to their own conditions than men's bodies. The lawyers who initially declined to take Grace Fryer's case were making calculations in which the gender of the plaintiff was almost certainly a factor in their assessment of how sympathetic a jury would find her. The corporate strategists who designed the delay and deny approach were targeting a population whose structural powerlessness, financial, legal, social, was enhanced by their position as young women from immigrant families in an era when all of those categories carried disadvantage. The women who fought back were, in this context, doing something that required them to navigate not only the specific corporate malfeasance that had harmed them, but the broader institutional landscape of a society that did not, in many respects, take them fully seriously. They navigated it, they won. The story of the Radium Girls is, in part, a story about what happens when people who have been discounted by the institutions that were supposed to protect them insist, nonetheless, on being counted. The insistence is not easy. It is not comfortable. It does not resolve quickly. It requires a tolerance for discomfort and uncertainty that is very difficult to maintain when you are also sick and in pain and dealing with the practical demands of daily life. The women who managed it through some combination of native determination, the support of people around them, husbands, parents, lawyers, journalists, the small network of solidarity that formed among the affected workers, and the simple fact that they had no alternative they were willing to accept. Accepting the company's version of events would have required accepting that their suffering was self-generated, that their bodies were the problem, that the glow they had thought was beautiful was something they had brought upon themselves by virtue of their own fragility. This was a version of events that they knew from the inside to be false. You cannot be told a lie about your own body and simply accept it if you are paying close enough attention to your own experience. The women of the dial painting studios were paying very close attention. They had to. There was no one else paying attention on their behalf. In the years since the Radium Girls cases became prominent in the historical consciousness, there has been a tendency in some tellings to make the story primarily an indictment, to focus on the corporation's malfeasance, the physician's complicity, the regulator's failure, and to present the women themselves primarily as victims. This tendency is understandable. The indictment is deserved. The malfeasance was real, and the complicity was real, and the failure was real. But something is lost when the women are primarily victims. The women were also agents, people who made choices, who took actions, who drove events rather than simply experiencing them. The decision to sue, in the circumstances Grace Fryer faced, was not a passive response to being harmed. It was an active choice, made against strong incentives in the other direction, requiring courage and persistence, and the particular kind of strategic thinking that is necessary when you are fighting from a position of structural disadvantage. The women were both harmed and brave, both sick and capable, both diminished by what had been done to them and enlarged in some important sense by what they chose to do about it. Holding both of those truths simultaneously is perhaps the most accurate way to remember them. The factory on Alden Street in Orange, New Jersey is gone. The building was demolished long ago. The site has been cleaned up. Imperfectly, as such cleanups tend to be, with some residual contamination still present in the soil beneath whatever currently occupies the space. The United States Radium Corporation changed its name repeatedly in the decades after the lawsuit, eventually ceasing to exist as a distinct entity through the normal processes of corporate dissolution and merger that accompany the passage of time. The dial painting industry itself persisted for decades after the 1920s, but under increasingly strict regulation and with the lip-pointing technique entirely prohibited. The luminous dials that had once used radium were replaced eventually by tritium, another radioactive isotope, but one with a much shorter half-life and far less potential for biological harm, used in a form that does not allow ingestion. The watches are still sold. Watches with luminous dials are everywhere, on wrists, in shop windows, in the catalogues of watch companies that advertise the particular satisfaction of reading the time in darkness. The glow is still there, but it is a different glow now, a safer one. A glow that is possible because the women on Alden Street made it impossible to make the old glow without legal and regulatory consequences. The next time you look at a watch dial in darkness and see the soft light of the numbers against the dark, hold that for a moment. What you are seeing is, among other things, a memorial. Let us return for a moment to the studio. Let us go back to the beginning of the story. Not to the legal proceedings, not to the courtrooms and the commission hearings, but to the place where everything started. To the long room on the upper floors of the Alden Street building on a winter morning in, let us say, 1919. The war is over. The men who went to France have come back, or most of them have, or enough of them to fill the streets with something that is not quite the ordinary energy of peacetime, but is at least not the frozen grief of wartime. The country is adjusting, the economy is adjusting, the appetite for consumer goods suppressed during the years of military production is beginning to express itself in ways that will define the decade. In the studio the light comes in from the east, and it is pale and thin and winter cold, and the women arriving for the morning shift stamp the snow off their shoes on the mat by the door, and hang their coats on the hooks along the inside wall, and tie their aprons and take their seats at the long tables. The tables are heavy, dark wood, scarred with the marks of years of use. Each seat has in front of it a small tray with a depression in the centre, and the depression holds a measure of the luminous paint, the zinc sulfide mixture with its tiny proportion of radium, the paint that glows so beautifully in the dark. There are cups of clean brushes, fine-tipped sable, the best available because the work requires precision that inferior brushes cannot provide. There are racks of unfinished watch frames, each one a small golden circle waiting for its numbers, each number a tiny act of craft that will allow someone, somewhere, to read the time in darkness. The women settle. The morning murmur of conversation, last night's picture show, someone's sister's engagement, the price of the wool for the coat one of the women is sewing, gradually gives way to the quiet concentration of work. Pick up the brush, draw it gently across the lip. The bristles collect moisture and draw to a point fine as a needle. Dip into the paint, apply with slow care to the tiny number on the dial face. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. The full circuit of the clock face, each number a separate act of careful placement, and then the minute markers, the small dashes between numbers, and the job is done and the frame goes into the drying rack, and another frame comes down from the unfinished stack. The work has a rhythm. It is one of those kinds of work that the body learns faster than the mind does. The hands develop their own intelligence, finding the correct pressure and angle through repetition until the action becomes something close to automatic, something you can do while your mind is elsewhere, while your conversation flows along its own track, while your eyes move between the dial and the window and the face of the woman sitting across the table. It is not unpleasant work. This is worth acknowledging. The historical narrative, with its knowledge of what the work was doing to the workers, tends to overlay the daily reality of the studio with a retrospective horror that the women themselves were not experiencing. In the moment, in 1919, the studio was simply where they worked. The work was skilled and well paid by the standards of what was available to them, and it was warm in winter and had good light, and the company of women they knew and liked. They talked about their lives. The conversation in a dial painting studio running all day across years of accumulated familiarity would have covered an enormous range of human experience. Births and deaths and marriages and courtships and the small dramas of neighbourhood life. Opinions about employers, about wages, about the picture shows and the music and the books that circulated among them, the particular pleasures and frustrations of young women's lives in an American industrial town in the years just after the war. Some of them were funny. There is something about long days of careful, repetitive work that produces a particular kind of humour. Observational, affectionate, slightly absurdist. The kind of humour that comes from spending enough time with the same small group of people that you know all their quirks and can find the comedy in the gap between how they present themselves and who they actually are. The studios would have had their comedians, their storytellers, their gossips, their quiet ones who listened more than they spoke. They were a community, in the deepest sense of the word. A group of people whose daily lives were intertwined in the specific ways that a shared workplace creates, who knew each other with the particular intimacy of people who have spent hundreds of hours in the same room doing the same work. The radium was in the paint on their brushes. The radium was going into their mouths dozens of times an hour. The radium was accumulating in their bones with every working day. But none of that was present to them in the studio, in the morning light, in the rhythm of the work and the flow of the conversation. What was present was the work and the company and the wages that would come at the end of the week and the particular small satisfactions of a day's production. The stack of finished frames growing in the drying rack, the visible evidence that skilled hands had done what skilled hands are designed to do. The paint glowed when the lights were off, and this was beautiful to them, and they had been told it was safe, and they had no reason not to believe it. And so the beauty was uncomplicated, purely aesthetic, a small pleasure in a working day that had its share of them and its share of the opposite. It is important to hold this, the ordinary uncontaminated pleasure of the studio, the morning light and the company and the rhythm of the work, alongside everything we know about what was happening simultaneously in the bone tissue of those careful hands, in the slowly accumulating store of radium that would eventually make itself felt in ways that the pleasure of the studio could not have predicted. History asks us to hold both things at once. The innocence of the moment and the knowledge of the retrospect, the beauty of the glow and what the glow was doing, the trust that the women placed in their employers, and the information that trust was concealing. This is an uncomfortable place to occupy. It is the nature of historical tragedy to force this kind of double vision, to ask us to see the past clearly, with the benefit of what happened next, while not allowing us to simply dismiss the reality of experience that preceded the catastrophe. The women in the studio in 1919 were real people having real experiences. Those experiences were, in many respects, positive. The work was good work. The community was a real community. The wages were real wages that made real differences in real lives. And all of that was happening inside a structure that was killing them. Both things are true, the truth of the moment and the truth of the structure. And the failure that the story documents is not the failure of the women who worked in good faith in the studio. It is the failure of the institution that allowed the structure to persist in full knowledge of what it was doing. The women who sat at those long tables on winter mornings in 1919 are not responsible for the harm that was done to them. That sentence is almost embarrassingly obvious, and yet it is worth saying plainly, because the history of industrial harm is full of narratives that locate responsibility in the wrong place, that emphasize the choices workers made rather than the information those choices were based on, that suggest a kind of complicity in their own suffering that the workers themselves categorically did not bear. The women chose to work. They chose every morning to sit down at those tables and point their brushes and do their work. They could not have chosen otherwise, because the alternative, refusing work, refusing the wages, refusing the community of the studio, was not a realistic option for young women in their economic circumstances. And even if it had been realistic, the choice would have been based on false information. They could not have chosen to avoid a danger they were not permitted to know about. The choice that was made, and that the story is actually about, was made elsewhere, in the offices of the United States Radium Corporation, by men who had the information, who had the power to act on it, and who made a different choice. The morning light in the studio was the same light. The rhythm of the work was the same rhythm. The conversation was the same conversation. The choice that mattered was made in the rooms they never saw. This is how large harms work. They are accomplished not through the dramatic single decision that can be pointed to in court and said to be the moment everything went wrong. They are accomplished through the accumulation of small choices made in the ordinary course of business by people who are not thinking of themselves as villains, who are thinking of themselves as practical men solving practical problems, who have learned to move their internal focus away from the human consequences of their decisions and toward the financial and legal metrics by which their professional success is measured. The men who ran the United States Radium Corporation were not, in most of the ordinary ways we measure such things, monsters. They were businessmen of their era. They operated within the norms of their industry and their time. They were presumably capable of love and friendship and generosity in their private lives. They coached their children's sporting teams and donated to their churches and worried about the things that businessmen worry about. And they poisoned their workers, systematically, with knowledge. And then they tried to cover it up. And then they tried to wait for the women to die before the legal cases could reach a conclusion. Both things can be true simultaneously. The ordinary human being and the institutional actor who makes decisions that harm other people. Understanding this is part of understanding how the pattern recurs. The pattern does not require monsters. It requires ordinary people operating within institutional structures that prioritize certain values over certain other values, that provide rewards for certain behaviors and not for others, that have developed over time an orientation toward profit and away from the full human reality of the people whose labor generates that profit. The structure is the problem. The structure is what needs changing, and changing structures is hard, grinding, incremental work that never fully succeeds and must be constantly renewed. The women in the studio on a winter morning in 1919 had no way of knowing that they would be the instruments of that change. They were just at work. The light came in from the east. The paint glowed when the room was dark. The conversation ran its course across the long tables, and the finished frames accumulated in the drying racks, and the shift whistle would blow in due course, and they would go home through the winter streets with the faint green light still on their hands. They were alive and working, and they did not yet know what was coming. Let us hold them there for a moment in that winter light before everything changed, to understand how a substance as genuinely dangerous as radium came to be painted onto watch dials by young women using a technique that introduced it directly into their bodies. It is necessary to understand something about how radium was perceived and discussed in the world outside the laboratory, the world of advertisements and magazine articles, and the general cultural consciousness of the 1910s and 20s. Because the story of the dial painters is also in part a story about the power of a narrative. The narrative of radium as a beneficial, life-enhancing, essentially magical substance was so powerful, so thoroughly distributed across the cultural landscape of the early 20th century, that it shaped the perceptions of the workers, the decisions of the companies, the responses of the doctors, and the reactions of the public in ways that allowed the actual danger to hide in plain sight for years. The radium craze, as historians have come to call it, was not a small or peripheral phenomenon. It was a substantial cultural moment, driven by the combination of genuine scientific novelty, the particular cultural appetite of a modernizing society for stories about progress and transformation, and the commercial interest of companies that had found a profitable product and needed the public to believe in it. The medical applications of radium were real, in a limited sense. Radium's ability to damage tissue made it, in carefully controlled doses, a useful tool against certain cancers, particularly tumours that were accessible to direct radium implantation or radiation. Radium therapy was practiced at the leading medical centres of the era, and while it was primitive by later standards, it did produce measurable results in some cases. The clinical reality of these results provided a foundation of legitimacy on which an enormous superstructure of commercial exploitation was constructed. The radium tonics were perhaps the most egregious expression of this exploitation. Products with names like Radithor, a solution of radium in distilled water, sold as a general health tonic, were marketed to wealthy consumers as a source of vitality, energy, and rejuvenation. Radithor's slogan was something close to certified radioactive. Its customers included prominent society figures, businessmen, athletes. The product was entirely unregulated. The story of Eben Byers, a wealthy Pittsburgh industrialist who became a devoted Radithor consumer in the late 1920s and who died in 1932 after consuming approximately 1,400 bottles of the product, illustrates the outer limit of what the radium craze could produce. By the time of his death, Byers's jaw and skull had been largely destroyed by the radium he had been drinking, and the Wall Street Journal's headline on his death is among the more memorable pieces of health journalism of the era. The radium water worked fine until his jaw fell off. The dark comedy of that headline and the grotesque specificity of Byers's case contributed significantly to the discrediting of radium tonics and the broader radium as medicine narrative. The Federal Trade Commission used the Byers case to move against Radithor and similar products. By the early 1930s, the radium health product industry had largely collapsed. But this collapse came after the dial painters were already sick. The cultural context in which they had been employed, the world in which radium was understood as beneficial, in which exposure to radium was associated with vitality rather than destruction, was still very much intact in the 1920s. A young woman being told by her employer that the luminous paint was harmless was receiving that assurance in a cultural context that made it entirely plausible. Why would radium be dangerous? Radium was in the health tonics. Radium was in the beauty creams. Radium was the element that scientists had associated with energy and life. The narrative of radium as beneficial was not simply a lie invented by the United States Radium Corporation for its own purposes. It was a pervasive cultural reality that the corporation was able to leverage, a pre-existing belief structure that made its workers more susceptible to deception, and its deceptions easier to maintain. This does not excuse the deception. The corporation's scientists knew the actual properties of radium. The distinction between external exposure, handled by the health culture's favourable framing of radium's warming properties, and internal exposure, the actual root of harm for the dial painters, was one that a trained chemist or physicist could make, and that the corporation's scientific staff were entirely capable of making. They had the information that would have allowed them to resist the cultural narrative and to base their worker safety policies on actual science, rather than commercial mythology. They chose not to use it. But the cultural context matters for understanding why the deception worked as long as it did, why the women in the studio did not demand more information, why the early symptoms were so readily attributed to other causes. The narrative of radium as beneficial was the water in which everyone in the story was swimming, and water that is everywhere is water that is hard to notice. The manufacturers of radium products were not, in most cases, operating from pure cynicism. Some of them believed the narrative they were promoting. The lines between genuine belief, wishful thinking, and deliberate fraud were blurry in the unregulated commercial culture of the era, and the radium craze occupied all three zones simultaneously. Some of the people selling radium water believed it would cure you. Some suspected it might not and chose not to investigate too closely. Some knew it would harm you and sold it anyway. The dial painters did not occupy any of these categories. They were workers, not consumers. They were not choosing to ingest radium in the expectation of health benefits. They were doing a job, using a technique they had been taught, in a context where the dangers were known by the people responsible for their safety and concealed from them by those same people. The radium craze provided cover, cultural cover, the warm surrounding fog of a narrative that made radium seem benign. But it was the corporate decision to deploy that cover, to use the cultural climate as a component of the strategy for managing worker safety, that transformed a cultural illusion into a deliberate harm. There is a wider point here about the relationship between cultural narratives and institutional decisions, about the way that the stories a culture tells about itself can become instruments of harm in the hands of institutions that have reason to deploy them strategically. The 1920s in America were a decade of enormous confidence in the beneficial potential of technology and industry. Progress was the operative word. Progress understood not as a process, not as something achieved through difficulty and resistance, but as a quality of the age, an intrinsic feature of a modern society moving in the right direction at increasing speed. The products of industrial technology were, in this narrative, inherently good. The companies producing them were inherently beneficial. The scientists and engineers at the frontier of the new were doing work that served humanity. This was a narrative that genuinely appealed to people, because it was, in many respects, true. The decade between the wars saw real improvements in material conditions for large numbers of people, in health, in mobility, in access to communication and entertainment, and the small luxuries that the consumer economy was learning to produce at scale. The confidence that technology and industry were working in humanity's interest was not irrational. But confidence can be weaponized. The same trust that made people receptive to the genuine benefits of industrial modernity made them vulnerable to claims made in the name of that modernity. When the United States Radium Corporation told its workers that the paint was harmless, that the scientists said so, that it was safe by design, it was drawing on a reservoir of trust in industrial institutions that those institutions had, in many respects, legitimately earned. The trust was real. The workers' belief was genuine. The harm that resulted from that belief was not the workers' fault. But the trust was misplaced in this case, and the reasons it was misplaced were structural, rooted in the institutional orientation of the corporation, in the incentive systems that shaped the decisions of its management, in the absence of regulatory oversight that would have provided an external check on those incentive systems. Remove any of those structural features, and the outcome changes. Add robust regulatory oversight, and the corporation cannot suppress drinkers' report without consequence. Change the incentive system so that the cost of worker illness falls on the corporation rather than on the workers, and the calculation that found it cheaper to let the women be sick is reversed. Provide workers with independent information about the hazards of their work, and the trust that the corporation exploited becomes less vulnerable to exploitation. These structural changes are what the Radium Girls cases eventually helped to produce, however imperfectly. They did not produce them quickly enough for the women who had already been harmed, but they produced them. The radium craze ended. The cultural narrative of radium as beneficial gave way to a more accurate understanding of its properties, driven partly by the dial painter cases, partly by the Eben Byers story, partly by the accumulation of scientific evidence that made the beneficial narrative increasingly untenable. The truth about radium, that it was a powerful, potentially deadly substance that required careful management and should never under any circumstances be ingested, became established knowledge, part of the common understanding of the educated public, no longer susceptible to the kind of commercial manipulation that had exploited the earlier ignorance. This is how scientific literacy spreads and why it matters, not as an academic exercise, not as a marker of educational sophistication, but as a practical protection against the specific kind of harm that ignorance makes possible. People who understand what radium actually does cannot be told that it is safe to drink. The cultural immunity that comes from accurate information is real immunity. The women on Alden Street deserved that immunity. They were denied it deliberately by the people responsible for their safety. What they built in the aftermath of that denial was a world that is slightly more immune than the one they started with. The legal story of the Radium Girls is not simply a backdrop to the human story. It is its own story, with its own characters and its own drama, and it changed the law in ways that are still operative a century later. Raymond Berry, who took Grace Fryer's case in 1926, was a lawyer whose practice was at the time relatively modest. He was not a labour activist in any formal sense. He was not affiliated with the major labour law firms of the era. He was a careful, methodical practitioner who looked at the evidence that Grace brought him and reached the same conclusion that any honest lawyer would have reached, that something wrong had been done, that it was legally actionable, and that the right thing to do was to take the case. The obstacles Berry faced in preparing the case were formidable in a way that modern legal practice, with its more developed rules of discovery and its more established precedents in occupational disease litigation, makes difficult to fully appreciate. The United States Radium Corporation had been operating for nearly a decade before the lawsuit was filed. It had accumulated, over those years, a substantial internal documentary record, medical reports, scientific assessments, correspondence between management and researchers, internal memoranda about workplace safety and worker health. Much of this documentation, Berry understood from the outset, would be damaging to the corporation if it reached the court record. The corporation's legal team understood this as well. The discovery process, through which a plaintiff's lawyers can compel the production of documents held by the defendant, was the critical battleground in the early stages of the case. Berry needed the documents. The corporation needed to prevent their production, or at minimum to delay it long enough to render it strategically useless. The motions that the corporation's lawyers filed in response to Berry's discovery requests are a study in procedural creativity. Every document request was the subject of a motion to limit, a motion to stay, an objection on grounds of privilege or relevance or scope. Every deadline was met with a request for extension. Every ruling that favoured Berry's position was subject to appeal. This was not unusual legal behaviour. The use of procedural mechanisms to delay and frustrate opposing counsel in civil litigation is a standard feature of the adversarial legal system, and it operates, in most contexts, without ethical implication. The system is designed to allow parties to advocate vigorously for their positions, and vigorous advocacy includes the full deployment of available procedural tools. But in the specific context of the Radium Girls case, where the plaintiffs were dying, where every month of delay was a month of continued deterioration, where the corporation's internal documents showed that its legal strategy was explicitly calibrated to the expected death of the plaintiffs. The procedural machinery of the legal system was serving a function that went considerably beyond vigorous advocacy. It was a tool of harm. It was being used to defer accountability until the people who bore the harm were no longer alive to press their claims. Judge William Clark, who presided over the early stages of the New Jersey case, found himself in the difficult position of applying rules designed for ordinary civil litigation to circumstances that were, by any measure, extraordinary. The 5 plaintiffs were visibly, measurably deteriorating over the course of the proceedings. Their physical condition at one hearing was observably different from their physical condition at the previous hearing. The progression of their illness was not an abstract concern. It was happening in his courtroom, at a rate that the corporation's delay tactics were calibrated to exploit. Clark's rulings on the discovery motions and the scheduling requests were, over time, increasingly favourable to Berry's position. He appears to have understood, or to have come to understand, that the procedural norms of civil litigation were insufficient to the specific injustice that was unfolding in his courtroom, and he used the latitude available to him as a judge to push the case toward resolution at a speed that the corporation's lawyers found frustrating. His intervention was not dramatic. He did not give speeches from the bench about justice or corporate responsibility. He did not violate any legal rules. He simply applied the available procedural mechanisms in a way that accelerated rather than delayed the case's progress, and he denied extensions that in other circumstances he might have granted. This kind of judicial discretion is not much celebrated in the history of the law. The dramatic rulings, the constitutional decisions, the landmark opinions that overturn precedent are what the histories of legal change focus on. But the exercise of discretion at the level of scheduling and discovery, multiplied across the thousands of cases that make up the daily operation of the court system, is equally consequential in aggregate. Judge Clark's rulings in the Radium Girls case are a small but real example of the judiciary functioning as it is supposed to function, as an institution capable of perceiving the difference between the formal requirements of procedure and the substantive demands of justice, and calibrating its exercise of discretion accordingly. The settlement that ended the New Jersey case in 1928 was not, in the strict technical sense, a legal victory. It was a negotiated resolution. The corporation did not admit liability. The settlement terms did not establish precedent in the formal way that a court judgment does. It was, in the vocabulary of the law, a private agreement between parties. But settlements are not invisible, particularly public settlements, attended by press coverage that described the terms in detail, that documented what the corporation had agreed to pay and why. The settlement in the Radium Girls case was not a secret. It was reported extensively, analysed by legal commentators, discussed in the professional literature of occupational health law. And it shifted the calculus for other corporations, other employers, other institutions making decisions about the cost of worker safety. A corporation that had denied liability for years, that had argued strenuously in court that no causal connection existed between its processes and its workers' illnesses, had ultimately settled. The settlement was not an admission, but it was a payment, and payments are, in the world of corporate risk management, a form of information. The information was, these cases can be won. The information was, workers who are willing to fight, and who find lawyers willing to take their cases, and who attract enough public attention to make the litigation politically costly, can extract accountability from corporations that have decided that concealment is the better strategy. This information was absorbed and acted on by the labour and public health communities who were watching the Radium Girls case. It informed subsequent litigation strategy. It provided arguments for advocates who are pushing for legislative changes to the statute of limitations and the regulatory framework. It demonstrated, in the most practical possible way, that the legal system could, at least sometimes, under the right circumstances, be used to hold corporations accountable for harm done to workers. The subsequent Illinois cases added to this foundation. The Industrial Commission proceedings, with their different procedural rules and their more direct focus on occupational causation, produced a different kind of record than the New Jersey litigation had. The Commission's findings in Catherine Donahue's case were specific and detailed. Specific enough that the Illinois Supreme Court, reviewing the appeal, had a clear record to work from. The Illinois Supreme Court's opinion in the Donahue case is a significant document in the history of occupational disease law. It addressed the statute of limitations question with a clarity that the New Jersey settlement had not fully provided, establishing in Illinois case law the principle that the limitation period for an occupational disease claim begins not at the date of exposure, but at the date when the worker knew or should have known of the connection between the exposure and the harm. This principle, the discovery rule as it came to be called, seems obvious in retrospect. Of course, you should not be denied legal recourse for a harm you did not and could not have known about. Of course, the clock should not run from the moment of exposure for a disease that takes years to manifest and whose connection to its cause was actively concealed. But it was not established law before the dial painter cases forced the question. The existing statute of limitations framework had been built around the assumption that injuries were immediate and apparent, the kind of harm that a person knew about as soon as it happened. Slowly developing occupational diseases did not fit that assumption, and the legal system had not yet adapted its rules to the reality that such diseases existed and that the people who suffered from them needed and deserved legal recourse. The Radium girls' cases made this adaptation necessary and eventually made it happen. The legal legacy extends further still. The concept of an employer's duty to inform workers about the known hazards of their work, a duty that the United States Radium Corporation and the Radium Dial Company had violated in the most comprehensive possible way, became central to the development of occupational health law in the decades following the dial painter cases. The right to know, as it eventually became known in the regulatory framework, is a principle that traces at least part of its lineage to the specific way that the corporation's concealment of known dangers had contributed to the harm done to the dial painters. The Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970, the legislation that established OSHA and created the federal regulatory framework for workplace safety, was not built directly on the Radium girls' cases. Several decades of labour activism, legislative effort, and regulatory development intervened. But the cases were part of the broader historical foundation on which the OSHA framework rested, part of the accumulated evidence of what happens to workers when employers are left to regulate themselves and when the legal system's default rules are inadequate to the realities of industrial hazard. Legal history, like all history, is a long chain of consequence. The specific individual acts of courage and determination that are at the visible end of the chain, Grace Fryer's decision to sue, Raymond Berry's decision to take the case, the women's refusal to settle on the corporation's early terms, are connected through decades of subsequent development to the framework that governs workplace safety for every worker in the United States today. The connection is real, even if it is not always visible. What becomes of a person who has spent years fighting a legal battle that was also a fight for their own survival, and who emerges from that battle still alive but still sick, with a settlement in hand and a body that continues to fail? This is the question that the histories of the Radium girls tend to address only briefly, because the dramatic arc of the story peaks at the settlement and then falls away into the quieter, more difficult territory of aftermath. But the aftermath is where these women actually lived, and it is worth spending some time there. Grace Fryer lived for several years after the 1928 settlement. She was not well. She could not have been well, given the accumulated burden of radium that her body continued to carry. She wore the jaw brace that had become, in the press photographs, almost an emblem of the case, a visual representation of the harm done to her that the camera could capture and that a newspaper reader could immediately understand. But she went on living. She was still Grace Fryer, still the person who had danced on Saturday nights, who had liked music, who had had plans and opinions and the particular self-possession that had made her effective both in the studio and in the courtroom. The radium had altered her body. It had not altered who she was. This is perhaps the hardest thing to convey about serious illness in a person with a strong character. The illness and the person coexist. The illness does not replace the person. It imposes constraints. It removes possibilities. It creates a daily reality of pain and limitation and the management of decline that requires enormous internal resources. But inside all of that, the person continues. Grace continued. She went to appointments with doctors who could not cure her, but could sometimes manage her symptoms. She had conversations with Berry about the ongoing legal questions that the settlement had not fully resolved. She spoke, occasionally, to journalists who wanted to follow up on the case, to understand what had happened and what it meant. She was, by the accounts that survive, not consumed by bitterness. This is not to say she was serene or accepting in any simple sense. Bitterness was entirely rational, given what had been done to her, and any suggestion that she was obligated to be other than bitter would be a second injury of a different kind. But she does not appear to have organised her inner life around the harm. She appears to have continued to be interested in the world, to care about the people around her, to find the things that made life worth living in the circumstances available to her. She died in 1933 at the age of 34. Edna Hussman had died the previous year, also in her early 30s. Irene Rudolph had died in 1930 at 29. The women who had sat at the long tables in the studio and pointed their brushes and talked about their lives were dying, one by one, at ages when most people are still in the early chapters of their adult lives. Quinta MacDonald and Catherine Schaub survived longer. Quinta lived until 1929, Katie until 1933. The annuities that the settlement had provided them were, in the event, paid for fewer years than the settlement's architects might have anticipated because the women whose lifespans the annuity was designed to support were dying so young. Tom Donahue, after Catherine's death in 1938 and the conclusion of the Illinois case in 1939, continued to live in Ottawa. He had been, throughout the years of Catherine's illness and legal fight, a consistent and devoted presence, not a dramatic one, not a man who sought the spotlight, but someone who did what needed doing and kept doing it. He worked, he raised their children, he attended the hearings and carried Catherine's papers and sat beside her as she gave testimony that she was too weak to give sitting up. After everything was over, he continued. There is something in the stories of the people around the Radium girls, the husbands, the parents, the siblings, the friends. That is its own chapter in the history. These were people who watched people they loved be destroyed by something they had no power to prevent, who had navigated years of medical appointments and legal proceedings and the particular exhaustion that attends the long illness of someone you love, and who had done so without the resources and support structures that we would, in a later era, consider basic requirements for people in those circumstances. They managed, they continued, they grieved and worked and found ways to live in the aftermath of loss that are, in their way, as remarkable as anything the fighting women themselves accomplished. The social networks that formed around the dial painter cases, the community of affected workers, the families who connected through the shared experience of the legal proceedings, the journalists and lawyers and advocates who had engaged with the story, constituted a kind of support structure, informal and unplanned but real. People who had met in the context of the lawsuit stayed connected afterward. Letters were written, visits were made. The particular bond that forms among people who have been through something difficult together endured beyond the event itself. In Orange, New Jersey, in the years after the settlement, the dial painting industry continued under changed conditions. The lip-pointing technique was no longer permitted. This was one of the practical changes that the case had produced almost immediately, a simple operational change that the corporation had been unwilling to make voluntarily, but that it could not resist making once the public and legal pressure was sufficient. The women who continued to work at the factory after the technique change were safer than their predecessors had been. Not completely safe. The radium was still present in the paint, still capable of causing harm through other routes of exposure, still a substance that required careful management. But the primary route of ingestion had been closed, and the levels of exposure for workers hired after the change were substantially lower than those experienced by the original cohort. This is a small, specific, practical consequence of the legal case. One of many small, specific, practical consequences that are easier to describe than the broader structural changes that the case contributed to. The women who were not harmed because a technique was changed are not visible in the historical record. Their health is not documented. Their names are not known. They are the invisible beneficiaries of the visible fight. The people who did not suffer because others had suffered before them and had insisted on change. The factory on Alden Street operated for several more decades, diminishing as the luminous dial industry changed and as regulatory requirements for radium use became increasingly stringent. By the time it closed, the technology had evolved. Radium had been replaced by other luminous compounds. The particular products that the original factory had been established to produce were no longer central to the industry's operations. The building was eventually demolished. The site was assessed for contamination. The assessment found what the physics of radium decay would have predicted. The substance does not go away quickly. The soil around the former factory retained elevated levels of radioactivity. The cleanup was extensive and imperfect, as such cleanups tend to be. The neighbourhood where the factory had stood, the neighbourhood that the workers had come from and returned to, where their families had lived, where the shift whistle had been audible from bedroom windows, is now a neighbourhood like any other in a post-industrial American town. The houses remain, the streets remain, the names on the mailboxes are different. But the history is there, in the soil and in the records and in the legal framework and in the stories of the women who worked at the long tables, and pointed their brushes and glowed in the dark and fought and changed something. The history is always there. We are always, in ways we often do not know about, living inside the consequences of what happened to someone else, in some other time, in some place we have never been. There is a version of the Radium Girl story that might have been written in a different era, a version in which the knowledge that existed in the corporation's files had instead been in the possession of the workers, in which the regulatory framework existed and was enforced, in which the medical community had the tools to diagnose what was happening before it became irreversible. In that version, the story looks entirely different. Workers notice symptoms. They are examined. The examination includes testing for radium in the body, testing that, by the time of the legal cases, was entirely possible and was in fact performed on the plaintiffs. The testing identifies the exposure. The exposure is traced to the workplace. Protective measures are implemented. The workers stop ingesting radium. Their bodies, to the extent possible, repair themselves. The harm is limited. Perhaps it is not entirely prevented. Some exposure will have occurred before the identification, some damage will have been done. But it does not continue for years. It does not accumulate to the levels that produced the jaw destruction and bone death and early mortality that the actual historical record documents. This counterfactual is not fantasy. The scientific and medical knowledge required for this different outcome existed. The techniques for measuring radium in the body were not beyond the capacity of 1920s medicine. The connection between radium ingestion and bone destruction was derivable from the existing scientific literature. The only thing missing was the will to apply the knowledge in the service of worker protection, rather than the institutional interest in concealing hazard. The medical practitioners who encountered the dial painters in the early 1920s were operating in a medical culture that was, in many respects, considerably less developed than the one we inhabit today. Diagnosis was more dependent on clinical observation and less supported by laboratory testing. The range of conditions that a physician was trained to recognize and the treatments available for those conditions were substantially narrower than the modern equivalent. The integration of occupational history into clinical assessment, asking patients what they do for a living, understanding what substances they are exposed to, connecting work to symptoms, was not yet a standard component of medical educational practice. These limitations were real. They contributed to the delay in diagnosis and the prevalence of false explanations for the dial painter's symptoms. A general practitioner in Orange, New Jersey, in 1923, encountering a young woman with jaw pain and bone disease, did not have available to him the specific pattern recognition that would, in a later era, immediately suggest occupational radium exposure. He reached for the diagnoses he knew, attributed the symptoms to diseases he was familiar with, and moved on to the next patient. This is not to excuse the false syphilis diagnoses, which were not made by physicians working at the limit of their legitimate medical knowledge. The physicians who attributed Molly Maggia's illness and death to syphilis, in the face of clinical evidence that was inconsistent with that diagnosis, in the context of a relationship with a corporation that compromised their independence, were not limited by the medicine of their era. They were compromised by their institutional relationships. The false diagnoses were a product of corruption, not ignorance. But for the ordinary general practitioners who saw the dial painters in those early years, the limitation of the available diagnostic framework was real and contributed to the delay in understanding what was happening. The treatment landscape was equally bleak. Radiation sickness, the slow, accumulative bone destruction produced by internal radium exposure, had no treatment in the 1920s. There was no way to remove radium from the bones once it had been deposited. The body's own machinery for managing the element, which had deposited it in the first place because it had mistaken it for calcium, had no mechanism for extracting it again. The radium stayed. Pain management was limited. The analgesics available in the 1920s were less varied and less effective than those available today. Morphine was the primary serious analgesic, effective but carrying its own costs in dependence and cognitive effect. The women who were in serious pain in the later stages of their illness managed that pain with whatever was available, which was not much and which was not adequate. Surgical intervention, where it was attempted, addressed symptoms rather than causes. Extracting a tooth that had become septic was addressing the consequence of bone death, not the bone death itself. Removing necrotic bone tissue was addressing the product of radiation damage, not the radiation. The surgeries were painful, often unsuccessful in their immediate goals, and entirely unable to address the underlying process of harm. The medical care available to the dying dial painters was, in other words, palliative at best and frequently counterproductive, causing its own pain and trauma without the compensating benefit of actual improvement in the underlying condition. This is part of what makes the corporation's behaviour so particularly difficult to contemplate. The harm done to the dial painters was not harm that medicine could undo. There was no treatment. There was no cure. The only intervention that would have made a meaningful difference was prevention, stopping the exposure before the damage accumulated to irreversible levels. Prevention was entirely possible. It required only the implementation of the protective measures that the corporation's own scientific staff and Cecil Drinker's report and the available scientific literature all supported. It required abandoning the lip-pointing technique, providing protective equipment, monitoring worker health, informing workers of the known risks. None of these things were technologically difficult. None of them were beyond the organizational capacity of a company that was successfully manufacturing luminous watch dials at scale. They were simply costly, in a narrow and short-term sense, and the corporation's management had decided that the cost was not worth paying. The price of that decision was paid by the women who had no access to treatment for the harm it caused. They bore the cost that the corporation had calculated it was cheaper to externalize, and they bore it in a medical landscape that offered them almost nothing to reduce their pain, and absolutely nothing to address the damage that was continuing to accumulate in their bones. The medical landscape has changed in the century since the 1920s. The specific harm of internal radium exposure is now understood in detail that would have allowed much earlier and more precise diagnosis. The regulatory framework that emerged partly from the dial painter cases means that workers in radioactive environments are monitored and exposure is tracked, and when exposures approach concerning levels, protective measures are taken. The treatment landscape has also changed, though less dramatically than diagnosis and prevention. The basic problem, that radium deposited in bone cannot be removed, remains, but pain management is substantially more effective. Palliative care as a medical discipline has developed enormously. The range of supportive interventions available to people with serious chronic illness is vastly greater than what existed in the 1920s. None of this helps the women who died in their 20s and 30s on the New Jersey streets where they had grown up. It helps the people who come after them. It is part of the same structure of accumulated improvement, in medicine as in law, in regulation as in science, that the Radium Girls cases helped to build, and that the people who benefited from it will never know they are benefiting from. The women on Alden Street deserved better medicine. They deserved treatment that could have helped them. They did not receive it, because it did not exist, and because the prevention that would have made treatment unnecessary was withheld from them by the people who had the power to provide it. What they received instead was the long, slow care of the people around them, their families, their friends, the network of support that human beings provide each other when institutions fail. Tom Donahue sitting beside Catherine as she testified. Grace Fryer's family managing her medical needs on the modest settlement income. The women in the dial painting community who are still healthy, visiting those who are not, carrying the ordinary goods of friendship, conversation, company, the small practical assistance that illness requires. This is not the medical care they deserved. It is not adequate in any meaningful sense to the need. But it was human and real, and it was what was available, and the people who provided it did so with a consistency and devotion that is its own kind of fact. Human beings are very good at caring for each other. We are not always good at building institutions that care for us. The gap between those two capacities, between individual human care and institutional care, is one of the persistent problems of organised society, and the Radium Girl story is one of the cleaner illustrations of what happens when that gap is wide enough to swallow people. Some of the dial painters at the Alden Street factory worked night shifts. The factory ran extended hours, particularly during the periods of heaviest wartime and post-war demand, and the night shift had its own character, distinct from the daylight hours. The supervisors were different, the pace was different, the particular energy that a room full of people generates in the afternoon, the ambient noise and movement of a large workforce, was quieter on the night shift, and the silences were longer, and the darkness outside the factory windows was complete. In the day, the paint on the dial faces was not very impressive to look at. A slightly silvery, somewhat dull mixture applied with care to tiny watch faces, not obviously beautiful in the context of a well-lit studio. You knew it glowed, you had seen it glow, but the daytime version was just paint. At night, when the studio lights were lowered between batches, or simply when someone happened to put the light out for a moment, the room changed. Every painted surface glowed, every rack of finished dials, every tray of open paint, every apron that had accumulated the day's inevitable splashes and smears, all of it radiated that cold green-white light, and the hands of every woman in the studio, luminous with the transferred glow of the element they had been handling all day, moved through the dark like something from a story about spirits. The women on the night shift were not frightened by this, or if they were frightened, they learned not to be. The glow became familiar, a feature of the night shift world, something you accommodated the way you accommodate any regular strangeness that your work produces. Some of them thought it was beautiful. We have established this. The beauty was genuine and unqualified at the time, before any of them had reason to connect the light to the illness. They were young women working a night shift in a factory, and in their working world there was this element of the genuinely magical, that their hands glowed, that the room glowed, that they carried the light home on their skin. The women who painted their nails with the luminous compound at the end of a shift were doing something that expressed, in a specific way, the relationship between beauty and modernity that the 1920s offered to young working women. The manicured nail was an aspiration of the era, a marker of feminine care and self-presentation, a small luxury that was increasingly within reach of working-class women as the decade progressed. To paint your nails with something that glowed in the dark was to take that aspiration and add to it the particular magic of the new technology, to use the product of modernity as a cosmetic, to make yourself luminous in the literal sense. There is something unbearably poignant about this, knowing what we know, the act of self-decoration with the very substance that was destroying them. But we should be careful not to project our knowledge onto their experience. They did not know what the glow was doing. They knew only that it was beautiful, and that it made them beautiful, and that the young men they smiled at with glowing teeth were delighted and a little bewildered. The night shifts also had another quality that the day shifts did not. They were quieter, more intimate, and in some ways more revealing of the individual characters of the women who worked them. In the day, the studio was full and social, the conversation distributed across many voices, the individual submerged to some extent in the collective. At night, with fewer workers and fewer voices, the conversations were sometimes longer and more personal. The women who worked nights together sometimes knew each other better, in the way that proximity and shared darkness permits, than they might have in the crowded, noisy day shift. These are the intimacies that history generally cannot document, the specific conversations that a particular pair of women had on a particular October night, the things they said about their families and their futures, the jokes they made about the supervisors and the customers whose watches would eventually carry the numbers they were painting. The content of those conversations is entirely gone. The fact that they happened is certain. The women on the night shift were not simply workers when the sun went down. They were the same people they had been on the walk to the factory, with the same inner lives and the same preoccupations and the same mixture of competence and weariness and occasional boredom that characterizes everyone who does careful work for many hours. The night shift gave those inner lives a particular frame. The quiet, the dark outside, the glow of the paint, the intimacy of a reduced workforce. There is something meditative about night work, for those who can accommodate its disruption to ordinary rhythms. The night shifts at Alden Street were not romantic in the literary sense, not the occasion for the kind of reflection that requires leisure. They were work, and work in conditions that were more tiring than the day, and the women who did them did so because the wages were real and the work was there. But the particular quality of the night, its quiet, its intimacy, its reduction of the world to the small lit circle of the workspace, is worth holding in the mind as we think about these women. They were real people in real circumstances, and the circumstances included this: that some of them spent many hours in the quiet dark with their hands glowing, painting small numbers onto watch faces, talking to the women beside them, thinking about whatever people think about at 2 a.m. when the work is quiet and the city outside is mostly asleep. They were alive, fully, specifically alive, in all the ways that being alive means, in the hunger and the tiredness and the occasional small joys, and the persistent background of hope that makes it possible to keep going. The radium was in their bones. And they did not know. The night shift eventually ended. The morning shift came in. The women who had worked through the night went home through streets that were coming to life. The early deliveries, the bakeries opening, the first commuters on their way to other factories and other offices. They went home with the glow still on their hands, fainter in the morning light, barely visible against the daylight's competition. They went home and slept, and while they slept, their bodies continued doing what bodies do, maintaining themselves, repairing themselves as best they could, performing the million small tasks of biological maintenance that constitute the quiet work of staying alive. And the radium in their bones continued to do what it did, also, decaying, emitting, delivering its invisible, steady assault on the tissue that surrounded it, the assault that their bodies were trying to repair and could not repair fast enough. Two processes running simultaneously in the same body, the body's attempt to maintain itself, the element's relentless damage. This was not a fair contest. But the women were still alive, still sleeping in the morning after the night shift, still dreaming in whatever form dreams took in a 1920s bedroom in Orange, New Jersey, still waking up, still going to work, still talking and laughing and pointing their brushes and doing their careful, precise, well-compensated work. For now. Orange, New Jersey is a small city now, the kind of post-industrial American town that carries its history in the texture of its streets and the faint marks of industrial purpose that its buildings still bear, even when those buildings have long since been converted to other uses. It sits in Essex County, west of Newark, and its downtown has the particular quality of American industrial towns that went through their peak in the first half of the 20th century and have been adjusting to the diminishment of that peak ever since. The people who live there now did not mostly work in the dial painting studios. The industry has been gone for generations. The specific memories, the women at the long tables, the glow of the paint, the smell of the studio, belong to people who are now very old, or to the children and grandchildren of those people, who carry the stories in the second-hand form in which family memory preserves them. But the place itself remembers, not in any mystical sense, but in the practical sense that places always retain the marks of their history in their physical fabric, in their soil, in the records that the institutions of a town keep as a matter of routine. The records from the legal proceedings are in the county courthouse, filed in the ordinary way of legal records, available to researchers who know to ask for them. The death certificates of the women who died, the ones that record the real causes and the ones that record the false ones, are in the Vital Records Office. The newspaper archives from the 1920s and 30s, digitized in recent years, allow anyone with an internet connection to read the contemporaneous accounts of the legal case in the same language in which they were originally written. The soil around the former factory site has been tested and retested over the decades, and the results of those tests are in the records of the Environmental Protection Agency and the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, available in the format of regulatory documents that are not designed for casual reading, but that contain, in their technical language, the factual record of what the factory left behind in the earth. The community organizations that formed around the legal case, the informal networks of solidarity that connected affected workers and their families, have left less of a paper record. They existed in the form that most human communities exist in, through shared experience and personal connection, and the kind of informal mutual support that does not generate documents. What survives is in the memories of the people who were part of them, and in the occasional letters and personal papers that have been preserved by families and donated to archives. Ottawa, Illinois, has a more visible memorial infrastructure. The town is smaller than Orange and has a more acute sense of its own history with the dial painting industry, perhaps because the proportion of the local population affected was larger, or perhaps simply because the community organised more deliberately around memory. There is a historical marker. There are local museum exhibits. There is an annual acknowledgement in the form of civic events of what happened to the women who worked at the Radium Dial Company. The Fox River, which runs through Ottawa, carries no particular trace of the factory now. Rivers are not good archivists. They move and disperse, and the particular contamination from the Radium Dial Company's operations has been diluted across decades of water flow into something below the threshold of measurable concern. But the community on the river's banks remembers. Memory is one of the things that communities do that institutions cannot fully replicate. An institution can keep records, can maintain archives, can file documents in the organised way that bureaucracy requires. But memory is different from record. Memory is the living connection between a past event and the people who carry it forward, a connection that is maintained through the specific forms of telling and retelling that communities use to hold their history. In Ottawa, the Radium Girl story has been told and retold across generations in the particular way that local stories are told, at kitchen tables, at family gatherings, at the community events where older residents speak to younger ones about what they know. The story has been absorbed into the local identity in a way that is different from how it exists in the National Historical Record, where it is a significant event in the history of labour law and occupational health. In Ottawa, it is also someone's grandmother, someone's great-aunt, the woman whose photograph is in a family album. These two registers of memory, the historical and the familial, coexist, and each tells a different truth. The historical record establishes facts, documents sequences, identifies causes and consequences. The familial record preserves the specific, the individual, the things that were too ordinary to appear in any official document. How she laughed, what she cooked, the way she carried herself when she was trying to be brave. Both are necessary. History without the specific is abstraction. The specific without history is sentiment. The Radium Girl story needs both registers because the women were both historical actors and specific people, and understanding either fully requires holding both. In the decades since Kate Moore's 2017 book brought the story to a new and substantial readership, the public memory of the Radium Girls has expanded considerably. The book reached readers who had never heard of the dial painters, for whom the story was entirely new, and it found an audience that was clearly ready to receive it. Some of that readiness is explained by the story's own qualities, its horror and its heroism, its visceral imagery and its clear moral stakes. But some of it is explained by the cultural moment in which the book appeared. The years around 2017 were years in which questions about corporate accountability, about the suppression of information by powerful institutions, about the specific vulnerability of women in institutional settings, were intensely present in public consciousness. The Radium Girls story, set a century earlier, was readable as a story about dynamics that were felt to be urgently contemporary. This is one of the things that historical memory does. It provides distance for the examination of patterns that are too close to examine comfortably in the present. The 1920s are far enough away that the specific actors and institutions are safely historical, that the examination of what happened can proceed without the defensiveness that is triggered by direct contemporary accusation. But the pattern, corporate knowledge, institutional suppression, worker harm, delayed and partial accountability, is close enough to the present that a reader in 2017 could feel its relevance without feeling personally accused by the historical description. The story travelled. It was adapted for the stage multiple times, in productions that found the theatrical core of the material, the confrontation between the corporation's institutional power and the individual women's determination, and made of it a drama that audiences found compelling and moving. It was discussed in classrooms and referenced in journalism, and cited in debates about regulatory policy. It became, in a short time, part of the shared vocabulary of a culture that was thinking hard about the questions it addressed. Whether this expansion of public memory produces practical consequences in regulatory policy, in corporate accountability, in the specific protections available to workers in hazardous industries, is a question that cannot be answered yet. The relationship between public memory and policy change is indirect and slow and subject to the vagaries of political circumstance. The story's availability in the cultural consciousness is a necessary but not sufficient condition for the changes its lessons would support. But the availability matters. Knowledge that is shared is harder to suppress than knowledge that is restricted to archives and academic publications. The story of the Radium girls, circulating in the public consciousness, in the form in which Kate Moore's book and the adaptations and the school curricula have put it, is knowledge that the next round of corporate concealment will encounter in the minds of the workers, the regulators, the journalists, and the citizens who will need to recognize the pattern when they see it. Recognition is not protection, but it is a precondition for protection. The town of Orange remembers, in its layered way, in records and soil, and the occasional family story that connects a great-grandmother's name to the events of a century ago. The town of Ottawa remembers more deliberately, in the public markers and civic acknowledgements that a community uses to tell itself about its own past. And the watches still glow, in the darkness of bedrooms and the dark corners of drawers where old timepieces are kept and occasionally noticed, the faces of watches that use luminous compound, safe compound, not radium, but the direct descendant of the technology that the United States Radium Corporation pioneered, still emit their faint, steady light. It is a domesticated glow now, a safe glow, a glow that exists because the unsafe version was fought and litigated and eventually replaced by something that serves the same function without the cost. The women who paid the cost are gone, the cost they paid is not. It exists in the legal framework and in the regulatory standards, and in the living memory of communities that have not forgotten what was done to them, and in the story that is being told here, now, in whatever quiet place you have found for yourself in the night. There is an hour before dawn that is unlike any other hour of the day. It is the hour when the night has done most of its work, when the darkness is deepest and most complete, not the fresh, newly fallen dark of early evening, but the settled, worn dark of a night that has been going for many hours, that has spread itself across everything and been absorbed into everything and become simply the condition of the world for a little while longer. In this hour, the factory towns are quietest. The night shifts are winding toward their end, but the transition has not yet begun. The particular sounds and movements of a shift change are still an hour away. The day workers are still sleeping, in their row houses and tenement apartments, in the beds they will leave in another hour when the alarm calls them to the kitchen, and the coal stove and the walk to work. The streets are empty, the river is quiet. The only sounds are the sounds that the night makes without assistance. The wind, the occasional dog, the far-off whistle of a train that passes through without stopping. In the studio on the upper floor of the Alden Street building, the night shift has been working for hours. The women at the long tables are tired, not the fresh tiredness of the early shift, but the particular bone-deep tiredness of the small hours, the kind that settles into the body like ballast, that makes even familiar work feel slightly effortful, that requires the will to continue where the early shift energy has been. But they continue. The frames come down from the unfinished stack, the brushes are drawn through the lips, the paint is applied in the small, careful strokes that the numbers require. The finished frames go into the drying rack. The process continues. In the quiet of this particular hour, the glow of the studio is most visible. During the day, even with the lights lowered, the ambient light from the windows competes with the luminescence of the paint and partially obscures it. But in the deepest part of the night, with the windows dark and no external light to compete with, the studio is lit almost entirely by the radium. It is not a warm light. It is cold, green-white, the colour of phosphorescence on a dark ocean, the colour of certain deep-sea creatures that have never seen the sun. It is steady and unflickering, none of the variability of flame, none of the slight mechanical pulse of electric light, just constant, even cold illumination. The women's hands move through this light with the ease of the long practice. They know the work too well to need to think about it in the small hours. The body does what the body has learned to do, and the mind is free to drift, to go where tiredness and the small hours permit it to go. Where does a young woman's mind go at 3 a.m, in a factory lit by cold green light? It goes where minds go in the quiet hours, to the things that matter most and the things that need resolving and the things that are simply present and unresolvable, that will be carried forward into tomorrow and the day after because there is nothing else to be done with them. To the people who are waiting, sleeping in the dark houses outside the factory windows. To the future, which at 20 seems both infinitely available and somehow slightly uncertain. A country that is entirely one's own but that one has not yet fully explored. To ordinary things. What will be for supper tomorrow? Whether the coat will need relining before winter, whether the man who has been courting will say what he is expected to say, and in what form, and what the answer will be, and what comes after. These are the thoughts of a young woman at work in the middle of the night a century ago, in a studio lit by the element that was already, in this moment, changing her bones. The thought and the process exist simultaneously, in the same body, without knowledge of each other, the planning mind moving through its ordinary landscape of hope and anticipation and mild anxiety. The radium moving through the tissues, finding the bone, depositing itself in the calcium matrix with the quiet efficiency of a substance that has found its natural home. Both are happening. The mind does not know about the radium does not know about the mind. This is not a metaphor. It is simply a description of what was happening in that studio in the small hours of an ordinary working night. At some point in the hour before dawn, the sky outside the factory windows begins to shift. Not light yet. Not anything that would be called light by a person watching for it. Just a very slight change in the quality of the darkness, an almost imperceptible movement from the deep, settled black of the middle night towards something that has within it the faint suggestion of the coming day. The women at the tables notice this, or some of them do. The horizon has a way of announcing itself before it shows itself, through some change in the atmosphere that working people who spend time in the dark learn to read. The end of the night shift is approaching. Another hour, or a little less. The pace in the studio adjusts slightly. Not hurrying. Hurrying makes mistakes, and mistakes in dial painting are visible and must be corrected, which costs more time than the hurry saved. But a certain alertness returns, the kind that proximity to the end of a long task produces, a mild reinvigoration of attention after the deep tiredness of the small hours. The frames are counted, the unfinished stack is assessed. The finishing of the night's production becomes a mild focus, a concrete goal for the hour remaining. Outside in the streets of Orange, the first sounds of the morning begin. A delivery cart, its wheels loud in the pre-dawn quiet. A door somewhere down the block. A dog that has been woken by something and speaks briefly to the dark before settling again. The city is beginning to wake, not yet awake. That is still an hour away. The particular transformation of a sleeping city into a moving one that happens every morning through an accumulation of small activations, each person and household and institution adding its energy to the collective until the threshold is crossed and the day is unmistakably underway. But beginning. The shift whistle will sound soon. The women will file out of the studio, past the supervisor's desk, down the stairs and through the door into the morning air. They will walk home through streets that are just becoming recognizable in the gathering light, past houses where their neighbors are waking, past the corner store that will be open in another half hour, past the church whose bells mark the hours from the tower visible from most of the neighborhood. They will go home and sleep, and while they sleep the day shift will arrive and take their places at the long tables, and the work will continue, frame after frame, number after number, the tiny careful marks that make it possible to read the time in the dark. The factory runs continuously in this way. The work does not stop between shifts. There is always a tray of paint, always a rack of unfinished frames, always a woman's careful hands doing the work that the customer's orders require. It is a continuous process, maintained by the rotation of workers through the studio, a stream of labour that flows without interruption through the hours of the day and night. The women are the medium through which this process flows. They're also its agents, skilled practitioners who bring their individual competencies to bear on the collective production, who make choices within the work that matter to its quality, who are not simply components of a machine but human beings exercising a skill. They are both medium and agent, both part of the industrial system that the United States Radium Corporation has built for the purpose of producing luminous dials, and individual people with inner lives and futures, and the full range of what human beings are and feel and want. The industrial system required their labour. It did not require their well-being. It did not require their health or their futures or the specific, irreplaceable individuals that they were. It required what it could extract from them in exchange for the wages it paid. And what it extracted, what it took from them in exchange for those wages, included everything that was beyond the reach of the wage, everything that no employment contract covered, everything that lay in the invisible space between what a corporation is and what a human being is. In the hour before dawn, in the studio lit by cold green light, the women at the long tables did not know this yet. They were thinking about supper and coats and the future that seemed entirely available to them, as the futures of 20-year-olds always seem, as a country not yet explored, but full of the promise of exploration. The dawn was coming, it came every morning, it would come this morning. And the glow in the studio would dim, as it always did, against the light of the new day, not extinguished, just out-competed, present still but no longer visible, hidden in the brightness, waiting for the dark to make it visible again. As it always was, as it always would be. The corporations that poisoned the Radium girls were never prosecuted under criminal law. No officer of the United States Radium Corporation was charged with a crime. No executive of the Radium Dial Company served time in prison. The individuals who made the decisions, who suppressed the drinker report, who arranged for false diagnoses, who calculated that it was cheaper to let the women die than to change the painting technique, face no personal legal accountability beyond whatever they may have experienced in their own private moral reckonings, if they experienced any. This is not unusual. The history of corporate harm in the United States, indeed in most jurisdictions, is overwhelmingly a history of civil liability rather than criminal accountability. Corporations pay damages. Their officers do not go to jail. The individuals who make the decisions that cause harm are protected in most cases by the legal structures of corporate form. The liability is the corporation's, not theirs, and even the corporation's liability is financial rather than penal. This feature of the legal landscape is not a secret, and it is not accidental. The corporate form was designed, among other purposes, to limit the personal liability of the individuals who invest in and manage corporations. This serves genuine economic functions. It allows capital to aggregate for productive purposes without exposing every investor to unlimited personal liability for every corporate act. But it also creates the specific kind of moral hazard that the Radium Girl story illustrates. The hazard that arises when the cost of harmful decisions is borne by people who are not the decision makers, and when the decision makers are insulated from that cost by the legal architecture of the entity through which they act. The people who decided not to protect the dial painters knew that their decisions would harm the dial painters. They knew this because they had been told, by their own scientists and by Cecil Drinker, and by the accumulating evidence of their workers' declining health. They proceeded anyway, because the financial calculation supported proceeding, and because the legal framework did not impose on them, as individuals, the full cost of that proceeding. If the officers of the United States Radium Corporation had been personally liable, in their own assets, their own freedom, their own futures, for the consequences of the decisions they were making, the calculation would have looked different. The decision that was financially rational for the corporation was not a decision that would have been made by individuals who faced its full personal consequences. This is an argument for corporate criminal liability that the Radium Girl story makes very clearly, and it is an argument that legal scholars and policy advocates have been making, with varying success, for decades. The movement toward holding individual corporate officers personally accountable for the harms produced by their institutional decisions has made some progress in some jurisdictions and in some areas of law. But it remains, in most contexts, a principle that is easier to articulate than to implement. The unfinished reckoning of the Radium Girl story is not, however, primarily about the individuals who escaped personal accountability. It is about the pattern that persisted after the specific case was resolved. We have noted the asbestos industry, the tobacco industry, the PFAS contamination. These are not coincidental parallels. They are expressions of the same pattern, the pattern in which an industry identifies a hazard in its products or processes, suppresses or manages the information about that hazard to protect its profitability, and deploys the legal system to delay accountability when the harm eventually becomes undeniable. The regulatory and legal framework that the Radium Girls cases helped to build was designed to interrupt this pattern. The Statute of Limitations reform the right to know provisions, the occupational safety standards. All of these were interventions intended to change the calculus that had made the pattern profitable. If workers have the right to know about hazards, the concealment strategy is legally riskier. If the statute of limitations does not run until the harm is discoverable, the delay strategy is less effective. If occupational safety standards are enforced, the prevention of harm is less optional. These interventions worked, to varying degrees. The dial painting industry using radium was cleaned up and eventually replaced. The asbestos industry was eventually forced to manage its hazard more responsibly, though only after decades of harm and litigation. The tobacco industry was eventually required to disclose what it knew and to bear at least some of the financial cost of the harm its products caused. But in each case, the pattern played out substantially before the interventions were effective. In each case, years and sometimes decades of harm preceded the accountability. In each case, the people who bore the cost of the initial harm, the workers, the consumers, the communities, bore it before the regulatory or legal framework caught up with the reality of the danger. This lag, between the production of harm and the accountability for it, is one of the persistent features of the relationship between industrial capitalism and the legal and regulatory systems designed to govern it. The harm is immediate and specific. The accountability is delayed and partial. The people who bear the harm bear it now, in their own bodies and lives. The accountability, when it comes too late for many of them. The Radium girls knew this. They fought within it, not against it. They could not change the fundamental structure. They could and did change specific features of it. The statute of limitations, the right to know, the occupational safety standards. These changes were real and consequential, but they did not resolve the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is that the people who make decisions about industrial hazards often have strong financial incentives to minimize or conceal those hazards, and that the legal and regulatory systems that exist to counterbalance those incentives are consistently less agile, less resourced, and less powerful than the industries they regulate. This is not a counsel of despair. The history of the relationship between industrial harm and regulatory accountability is a history of imperfect progress, of interventions that are too slow and too partial, but that do, over time, reduce the prevalence and severity of specific harms. The dial painting industry using radium is gone. The specific harm it caused cannot recur in that specific form. The asbestos industry is extensively regulated in ways it was not in 1930s. The tobacco industry is constrained in ways it was not in 1950s. Each reduction in harm is real, even if it came too late for the people who bore the initial cost. The work of building and maintaining the framework that prevents harm is unglamorous and incremental and never finished. It requires continuous effort by people who are mostly not famous and not celebrated, and who do their work in the obscure reaches of regulatory agencies and labour organisations and legal advocacy groups and research institutions. These people are the heirs of Grace Fryer and Raymond Berry, and the others who fought for the changes that made the world slightly safer for the workers who came after them. They do not receive much recognition. The recognition goes, rightly, to the people who bore the original harm and fought against it. The people who maintain the framework they fought to build are invisible in the way that all maintenance is invisible. You notice the system when it fails, not when it works. But it works sometimes, not perfectly, not always, not without constant pressure and vigilance, but enough that the people who work in dial painting studios today, studios that exist using safe luminescent compounds, producing the same kinds of watches that the Orange and Ottawa factories produced a century ago, go home at the end of their shifts without radium in their bones. They do not know the names of the women who made that possible. We know. The reckoning is not finished. The pattern persists, in new industries, new substances and new workplaces, and the fight to interrupt it continues, and the people doing that fighting are in some real sense the continuation of what the Radium girls started. The story does not have an ending. It has a point where we choose to stop telling it for now, and to return to the quiet of the room, and the time of night, and the particular peace that comes from having sat for a while inside the full weight of a story that mattered. Let us say their names one more time. Grace Fryer, Edna Hussman, Irene Rudolph, Catherine Schaub, Kinta MacDonald. These are the 5 women who filed suit against the United States Radium Corporation in May of 1927. They are the women whose names appear in the court records, whose photographs were taken by the press photographers who covered the case, whose words are preserved in the testimony and correspondence that the legal proceedings generated. Catherine Wolfe Donoghue, and the other Ottawa women, Inez Corcoran, Marguerite Glasinski, Frances O'Connell Leach, Helen Munch, Pearl Payne, and others whose names are preserved in the records of the Illinois Industrial Commission proceedings. These are the women who carried the fight into the 1930s, who faced the same institutional machinery that their New Jersey predecessors had faced, who were, by the time they filed their claims, further along in their illnesses but no less determined in their resistance. And then there are all the others, the women whose names are in the employment records of the factories, in the medical files, in the county death records, in the family memories of the towns where they lived. The women who were sick but did not sue, or could not sue, or died before they understood clearly enough what had happened to them. The women whose suffering was documented by the company's own concealed medical records, and then buried in those records, and only partially recovered by subsequent investigation. There were many. The exact number is uncertain, because the records are incomplete, and the identification of cases that belong to the radium exposure is sometimes a matter of inference, rather than direct evidence. Estimates of the total number of dial painters who experienced radium-related illness across both the New Jersey and Illinois facilities, and the Connecticut facility, which existed alongside these two and has its own partial record, run into the hundreds. Hundreds of women, hundreds of specific people who sat at long tables and painted tiny numbers onto watch faces and pointed their brushes between their lips because they had been told it was safe. Most of them are not famous. Most of their names are not known outside the small circles of family and local community that have preserved them. They are part of the mass of ordinary people whose experience of the 20th century was shaped by the large forces that the famous people and the famous cases and the famous legislation addressed, but who themselves are not remembered in the way that history reserves its memory for the visible and the documented. This is the nature of history, and it is a limitation of history, and the most that can be done about it is to acknowledge it explicitly. To say that the women whose names we know stand for the women whose names we do not, that the specific stories we have told in this account are representative of a much larger pattern of specific stories that deserves equal recognition even if it cannot receive it in this form. The women whose names we know were not more important than the women whose names we do not. They were more visible, because they made the choice to fight in the specific ways that generate visibility, through the legal system, through the press, through the public record that a lawsuit produces. The women who could not or did not fight in those ways were not less harmed, not less brave, not less deserving of acknowledgement. We acknowledge them here, in the space that this telling makes available for them. The unnamed women, the women in the employment records whose names are listed without subsequent history, the women whose death certificates were falsified and whose families were told it was syphilis and who never knew, and whose families never knew, that what had happened to them was something different and that someone was responsible for it. They were real people. They lived real lives. The harm that was done to them was the same harm, done by the same institution for the same reasons. Their absence from the visible historical record is not a judgment on them. It is simply a consequence of the way that visibility and invisibility are distributed by the forces of power and resources and historical accident. We can do something small about this in the act of telling the story, in choosing not to let the named women exhaust the story's recognition, in explicitly making space for the unnamed ones. It is not adequate, but it is what is available. The names that are known, Grace, Edna, Irene, Catherine, Quinta, Catherine, have become, in the century since the 1920s, something more than their historical reference. They have become a kind of shorthand, a way of invoking a set of values and a set of questions that the historical events they are attached to represent. When the Radium Girls are invoked in discussions of occupational safety, they are being invoked as evidence of what happens when safety is not adequately protected. When they are invoked in discussions of corporate accountability, they are being invoked as evidence of what institutions do when profit and safety come into conflict, and the regulatory framework is insufficient to resolve that conflict in favour of safety. When they are invoked in discussions of women's rights and the historical treatment of women in institutional settings, they are being invoked as evidence of the specific vulnerabilities that gender created in the context of industrial labour. These are legitimate and important uses of their names and their story. The historical record should be used as history has always used, as evidence, as example, as argument, as the accumulated experience of human beings navigating the specific challenges that their time and circumstances presented. But the names also belong to the people they were given to. Grace Fryer was not primarily a symbol of occupational safety advocacy. She was a young woman from Orange, New Jersey, who liked to dance and lost her jaw and spent years of her life fighting for acknowledgement of what had been done to her. The symbol is secondary to the person, even if the symbol is what survives in the public memory. Holding both things, the historical significance and the individual person, is the fundamental challenge of historical empathy. It requires the willingness to approach the past not as a collection of lessons and precedents and useful examples, but as a space inhabited by people who are as fully themselves as we are, who had inner lives and specific desires, and the particular combination of strengths and limitations that constitutes a real human being. They were not heroes in any uncomplicated sense. They were people who did difficult things in difficult circumstances, who were capable of courage and determination, and also of ordinary human ambivalence and limitation, and the desire to simply be well and left alone that any seriously ill person feels at some point in the course of their illness. They were people who were wronged, and they were people who refused to accept that being wronged was the end of the story. That refusal, specific and individual in each of them, taken for different reasons and at different moments and with different degrees of conviction and doubt, added up, collectively, to something that the historical record can document and that the legal and regulatory framework can point to. They changed something, not enough, not quickly enough, not for everyone who needed changing to happen, but something real, something durable, something that is still operative in the world in the form of protections that exist because they fought. Grace Fryer died at 34, Edna Hussman at 31 or 32, Irene Rudolph at 29, Catherine Schaub at 33, Quinta MacDonald in her early 30s, Catherine Donahue at 35. Young deaths, lives cut short by a harm that was preventable, that was known to be preventable, that was not prevented because the institution responsible for prevention had decided that prevention was too costly. The years they did not live, the decades they should have had, the people they should have become, the things they should have done and experienced and been, are not recoverable. They are simply gone, a subtraction from the world that the world cannot undo. But what they did in the years they had, the specific, determined, costly fight they waged against the institutional power that had harmed them, is not gone. It persists. It is part of the structure of the world. We are in it, here, now. We are living inside the consequences of what they did. We are, in the most practical possible sense, the beneficiaries of their work. This seems like a good place to rest the story for tonight, in the awareness of what was done, and by whom, and at what cost, and with what consequence, in the quiet understanding that the world is different because these women existed and fought, and that the difference is real, even if it is imperfect, and that real and imperfect is the form that all human achievement takes. The glow is still there, in the watches and the historical record and the regulatory framework and the names that we say when we tell this story. It does not fade. It persists, steady and cold and green-white, the light that outlasted the women who made it and will outlast us too. It is the kind of light that does not require attention to keep burning. It simply burns. History is made of large events and small choices, and it is usually the small choices that do the actual work. The large events are what we remember, or what we are taught to remember. The lawsuits filed, the settlements reached, the legislation passed, the regulatory agencies established. These are the landmarks, the things that can be pointed to in a timeline and used to mark the passage from one era to another. But the large events are made of small choices, accumulated across years and across thousands of individual decision-makers, and understanding the large event requires some attempt to understand the small choices that went into it. Consider the small choices that went into the harm done to the Radium girls. The choice of the scientist who wrote the laboratory report noting abnormalities in worker blood counts, and then filed it in a way that his supervisor could retrieve it and act on it or not act on it. He made a choice, in that filing, that was technically correct. He had documented his findings. They were in the record. And that was, at the same time, a choice not to press harder, not to escalate, not to insist that the finding be acted on rather than managed. He may have had reasons. Most small choices that contribute to large harms have reasons behind them. The scientist had a career at the company. He had colleagues he worked alongside and did not want to antagonize. He had a professional culture that did not reward whistleblowing, and that provided considerable social and professional pressure toward accommodation with the institutional view. He made the choice that minimized immediate conflict, and in making it he contributed, in a small way, to the harm. Consider the choice of the physician who attributed Molly Maggier's illness to syphilis. He had a relationship with the company. He had professional incentives that aligned with producing a diagnosis favourable to the company's interests. He had possibly a genuine belief, or a genuine capacity to convince himself, that the evidence was ambiguous, that a syphilis diagnosis was defensible, that a physician could look at this patient and reach this conclusion in good faith. Or perhaps not. Perhaps he made the choice with full clarity about what he was doing, trading his professional integrity for whatever the company's goodwill was worth to him. We cannot know from the historical record which version of the story is closer to the truth. What we know is that he made the choice, and that the choice had consequences for Molly Maggier's family and for the subsequent management of the case, and that similar choices were made by others, other physicians, other scientists, other company officials, whose individual small choices aggregated into the systematic harm that the legal cases eventually brought to light. The opposing small choices are equally worth examining. Cecil Drinker, when he discovered that his report had been falsified, made a choice. He was a professional in a position that gave him something to lose by pressing his complaint. He pressed it anyway. He wrote letters. He threatened legal action. He ensured that his original findings, the real findings, were not buried permanently under the falsified version. This was not a heroic gesture in the dramatic sense. It was a series of professional communications, letters, in the ordinary postal format of 1920s academic correspondence. But the choice to send those letters, in the face of pressure not to, was a real choice, and it had real consequences. The journalist who first covered the case, who chose to pursue the story of the sick dial painters against the resistance of a corporation that was, in the 1920s, a respected industrial employer with connections to the networks through which business advertising flowed to newspapers, made a similar kind of choice, small, specific, professional, but consequential. Raymond Berry's choice to take the case is perhaps the most consequential of the non-plaintiff choices in the story. He took a case that most lawyers had declined, for reasons that were professionally rational. He took it knowing that it would be expensive, difficult, and uncertain. He took it because he looked at the evidence and made a judgment that the case was worth taking. This judgment, that the case was worth taking, was not merely a professional assessment of likely outcome. It was a moral judgment, a judgment that what had been done to Grace Fryer and the others was wrong, and that wrong things should be contested, and that the role of the law in contesting wrong things was something worth doing even when it was hard. Berry was not, as far as the historical record suggests, a crusader. He was not someone who specialised in labour cases or who had a particular ideological commitment to workers' rights. He was a lawyer who took a case on its merits, and among the merits was the simple fact that something unjust had been done to people who needed someone in their corner. The small choice to take the case changed the direction of multiple lives and contributed, through the chain of consequences we've traced, to changes in the law that affected millions of workers who never knew Berry's name. This is how small choices work. They extend forward in ways that the people making them cannot fully see. The scientist who filed his report and did not press harder probably did not think of himself as contributing to years of harm. The physician who wrote the false diagnosis probably did not think of himself as the person whose falsification would eventually be exhumed and used to prove the company's knowledge. Cecil Drinker, writing his letters, probably did not imagine that they would be cited in legal proceedings decades later. Raymond Berry, taking a difficult case on contingency, probably did not envision the chain of legal precedent that would follow from the work he was beginning. We make choices without full knowledge of their consequences. This is simply the condition of acting in the world, where the future is always at least partially opaque and the ripple effects of individual choices extend into territory we cannot see. The best we can do, given this condition, is to try to make choices that are oriented toward the right things, that take seriously the interests of the people they affect, that are honest about the information available, that are willing to accept short-term costs for the sake of longer-term goods. The choices that led to the Radium Girls' harm were oriented toward the wrong things, toward financial metrics that did not fully account for the cost of worker harm, toward institutional interests that were in conflict with the interests of the workers the institution employed. They were choices made within a framework that rewarded those orientations and provided limited countervailing pressure toward different ones. The choices that led to the accountability, berries, drinkers, the women's own, were oriented toward the right things, even when those things were costly and difficult and uncertain of outcome. They were choices made by people who were willing to be inconvenienced, professionally and personally, for the sake of something that mattered beyond their own immediate interests. This distinction between choices made primarily in service of the institution's financial interests and choices made in service of what was actually right is simple to state and enormously difficult to maintain in practice. Institutions exert powerful pressure on the people within them to orient their choices toward institutional interests. The professional culture, the reward systems, the social dynamics of the workplace, all of these tend to align individual behavior with institutional priorities, whether or not those priorities are the right ones. The people who chose differently, who filed the real report, who took the case, who testified at great personal cost, were choosing against those pressures. That is what made their choices difficult and consequential. It is what makes any choice against institutional pressure difficult and consequential. The Radium Girls made this choice. They chose to contest what had been done to them against an institutional opponent with vastly more resources and power. They made this choice from positions of personal vulnerability, sick, increasingly physically diminished, without financial resources commensurate to the fight they were undertaking. They made it anyway. Not because they were extraordinary in any innate sense, not because they were born with capacities that other people lack, but because they were in a situation that made the choice available to them, and they took it. The situation made the choice available. The people took it. Both things are true, and neither is sufficient without the other. The situation without the people produces nothing. The people without the situation, without the legal opening that Berry identified, without the press attention that made public awareness possible, without the industrial hygiene community that provided expert testimony, would have had fewer tools. But the tools, available in the right hands, produced the fight, and the fight produced the change, and the change is here, in the world, a century later, still operative. The weight of small choices is enormous. We do not always feel it, because the consequences of any single choice are usually not immediately visible and are often never visible to the person who made them. But the choices accumulate. They add up. They build the world that the next generation inherits. Grace Fryer and the others built part of our world. They built the part that has to do with the safety of workers in hazardous environments, with the right to know about the hazards of one's work, with the legal recourse available to workers who are harmed by their employer's concealment of known dangers. We live in that part of the world. We are the people who come after. There is a photograph of Grace Fryer that was taken during the legal proceedings, probably in 1927 or 1928. She is seated. She's wearing the jaw brace, the metal and leather apparatus that has become, in the press coverage of the case, almost a symbol in itself, a visual representation of the harm that the case is about. The brace is visible below her chin, where it holds the structure of her lower face in an alignment that her own bones can no longer provide. But her face, above and around the brace, is something different from what the brace might suggest. She's looking directly at the camera. Her expression is composed, neither defiant nor defeated, simply present. The eyes are clear. There is in her expression no self-pity and no theatrics, no attempt to perform suffering for the camera, no effort to look braver than she feels. She simply looks like someone who is there, who is paying attention, who is ready for what comes next. This is how she was described by the people who encountered her during the case, by Berry, by the journalists who interviewed her, by the social workers and medical staff who attended to her during the proceedings. Composed, present, precise in her language, not easy to knock off balance by the company's tactics or the procedural delays or the physical demands of appearing in court while seriously ill. The photograph is not a famous photograph in the way that some historical images become famous. It does not have the iconic quality that makes certain images immediately recognizable across cultural contexts. But it is a remarkable image. It documents a particular person at a particular moment, and what it documents is not primarily the brace or the illness, though both are present. What it documents is the person. What remains of the Radium girls is mostly exactly this: specific documented evidence of the specific people they were, the photographs, the testimony transcripts, the letters, and the occasional personal papers that families preserved, the medical records, the legal filings, the newspaper accounts that, whatever their other limitations, tended to spend time with the women themselves, to quote them, to describe them, to acknowledge their individuality even within the journalistic conventions of the era. These documents are not abundant. For ordinary working women in the 1920s, the personal paper trail is thin by the standards of any era, and particularly thin by the standards of our own, in which every digital interaction generates a record. There is no extensive correspondence, no diary, no archive of personal expression that would allow a biographer to reconstruct the inner life in detail. What exists is the public record, the words that were spoken in court, in interview, in the formal exchanges that the legal case generated, the photographs taken by press photographers who were there to cover a story, not to preserve a memory, the medical records which document the body in the clinical language of diagnosis and examination, and the family memories, the stories that were passed down through the families of the women who died and through the communities they lived in. These are the most fragile of the remaining evidences. Oral tradition is vulnerable to forgetting, to distortion, to the ordinary mortality of the people who carry it. But some of it has been preserved in the interviews that historians and journalists have conducted with descendants, in the local historical archives that Ottawa and Orange have assembled. What remains is enough to know who these women were in the specific and limited way that historical knowledge allows us to know anyone, enough to tell the story in a way that respects both its facts and its human weight, enough to say their names with the confidence that we are naming real people, not abstractions. Grace, who liked to dance, Edna, who read novels, Irene, who sang while she worked and was going to be married, Katie, who kept the notebooks and drew in the margins, Quinta, who was there and who fought and who died young, Catherine, who testified lying down and whose husband carried the case to completion after her death. The physical traces of their lives are distributed across the landscape of the places where they lived and worked and fought, in the archives, in the soil, in the faint radioactive signature that some of their graves still bear, in the legal precedents that carry the logic of their cases forward into a present they did not live to see. And in the stories told by the families and the local communities, the stories told by the journalists and the historians, the stories told by the playwrights and filmmakers who found in this material something that demanded theatrical form, the particular urgency of events that need to be enacted, not just recounted. And this story, this telling in the quiet hours for the person listening in the dark, you have been here for the whole of it, in whatever form listening takes for you, in the particular attention that a story requires, in the willingness to stay with material that is, in its core, material about harm and resistance and the distance between the two. That willingness is a form of acknowledgement. It says, this happened and it mattered, and it is worth sitting within the dark at this hour, in whatever quiet place you have found. History asks this of us, not that we be crushed by it, not that we carry it as a weight that prevents the ordinary functioning of our lives, but that we acknowledge it, that we let the knowledge of what was done, and by whom, and at what cost, and with what consequence be part of what we know about the world. The world is better and worse than we usually understand it to be. Better, because of the accumulated efforts of people who fought for the things that were right, people like the women on Alden Street, and like the countless others throughout history who chose difficulty over accommodation when the difference between them mattered. Worse, because the forces that produce harm are persistent and adaptable, and have not been defeated, only contested. Both things are true, and knowing both things, holding the improvement and the unfinished fight simultaneously, not resolving the tension between them into a simple narrative of progress or a simple narrative of despair, is, perhaps, the most honest relationship to history that we can maintain. The women on Alden Street are gone, the factory is gone, the radium paint is gone. The glow remains. It remains in the legal framework, in the regulatory standards, in the names that are said when the story is told, in the story itself, which has been spreading through the culture for a century and has not exhausted itself, has not lost its capacity to reach people who have not heard it before and to matter to them, has not ceased to be the kind of story that people feel the need to tell. A story that cannot stop being told is a story that is doing something that its tellers often cannot fully articulate, something that works through the telling itself rather than through any specific lesson it imparts. The Radium Girl's story works this way. It is not reducible to its lessons, however important the lessons are. It is not exhausted by its legal legacy or its regulatory impact. It is a story about specific people in specific circumstances who did specific things that had specific consequences, and it is also something larger than any of those specifics, something about human dignity and institutional power and the capacity of ordinary people to matter beyond themselves. We carry it forward in this telling as it has been carried forward in every telling since Grace Fryer sat in a courtroom in a jaw brace and looked directly at the people who had harmed her and told them what she knew. The glow remains. It is in the story, in the telling, in the hearing. It does not fade. And so the story settles, like dust in an empty room, like the last light through a window at the end of a very long day, like the breathing of a city that has worked itself through to the quiet side of midnight and is, for a few hours, at rest. The factory is gone, the courts are dark, the lawyers and the judges and the corporations have dissolved into the long tide of time that takes everything eventually, the powerful and the powerless alike, the architects of harm and the fighters against it, the building on Alden Street and the women who filled it. What remains is the story. And the glow. Faint and cold and steady, the way the best things are. Wherever you are tonight, in whatever room, in whatever hour, you carry now something you did not carry before. The names, the light, the knowledge of what was done and what it cost and what it changed. Let it rest quietly inside you, alongside everything else you carry. The night is deep, the world is still. There is nothing more to do now but sleep. So sleep. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one. Which aspect of the Radium Girls story do you find most striking? The courage of the women who chose to fight, the corporate cover-up that suppressed the truth for years, or the lasting legal legacy that still protects workers today? Let us know in the comments below.